Welcome everyone for this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. We just ended our last symposium on the Earth's next 100 years. It was about 8 weeks of presentations dealing with science, physical economy, philosophy, and a lot of big ideas that are going to be very important to grapple with now as we go into the 22nd century and beyond. Our next symposium is going to shift gears a little bit and deal with the role of literature as a platform to understanding universal history. So how certain truths can't necessarily be told literally, but are, and this is something that's not new. This is not a new idea. This goes back to the ancient times in various cultures that metaphor has to be used as a language to express certain truths when it is not politically possible or even desirable to express things in a literal way. So that'll be the next symposium. However, that won't begin until January 1st, the new year. Until then, we have a special series of presentations that will deal with the art of history in varying ways. This week, next week, all the way up until the 19th of December, we're going to have presentations to help us appreciate some of the drama of our past in order to better understand where we're going, what shaped our conditions that we find ourselves in today. Today, the first of this series of 4 presentations will be delivered by our great friend Marty Sieff, who has been just at the cutting edge of journalism and historical research now for quite some time, and he's published enormously. You can find his works on China Daily, or People. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Is it People's Daily? I'm mistaken.
I think it used to be, but it is the China Daily now.
China Daily now. Yeah, that's where he's publishing a lot of his stuff. He's also written several books. I'm going to put them in the description of this video as well for people who get a little taste of Marty's mind in action and want to read some of his thoughts. There's a new book that he's currently written, which should be hopefully hitting the presses sooner than later. Yeah, fingers crossed. And I'll just stop right there. You know what? We're gonna learn a lot today, and I'm just gonna sit back, enjoy the ride. Marty, it's all yours. Go for it.
I'm a creature of my time and place. My time and place was the end of the British Empire, on the edge of the British Empire, where we therefore took the British Empire even more passionately and seriously. In Northern Ireland, in the 1950s, right after the great victory of World War II. And growing up, I had the anomaly of growing up in a working class part of Northern Ireland, but my father was extremely enterprising and was able to wangle me at a very early age into one of the best schools in the city. And I flourished there for the next 13 years, and they eventually propelled me off the streets of North Belfast and into 2 degrees at Oxford University. But they also had an excellent history library, and I was drunk in history from an early age. And I devoured the memoirs of Winston Churchill on both World War II and, less well remembered now, though actually much more readable, his memoirs on World War I, the world crisis. And I love them. And Churchill was my hero. And when I was at university, the irony was, for me now, the me of then would have looked on the me of now with absolute incomprehension and horror. And I was not the kind of person who went through a sudden lightning change in my life, you know, on the road to Damascus. You suddenly become, from Saul to Paul, the opposite of what you were. When I look back, the changes in my life were incremental. They came here and here and here, and they built up. And it's only like climbing up a very high but gradually sloping hill. You're not conscious of how high you're going until, or how far you've come, until you look back and see the difference. Now we jump forward a very long time to the year 2000, and I'm working for United Press International, and I'm one of the top people, and I have a trip in Istanbul and in Turkey. And I've been to Istanbul often before. I adore Istanbul. It's one of my favorite cities for a whole variety of reasons. And one thing I will simply add to anyone here is, if anyone here loves a good fish dinner, the finest fish restaurants on earth, I think, are virtually all in Istanbul. Nowhere else comes close. And many of them are actually on the Bosphorus, right below the Bosphorus Bridge, on both banks of the river there. But because I was with United Press International, I had very indulgent editor-in-chief and president of the company at the time, and later became editor-in-chief myself. I was able to take time there. And usually when I did these trips, you know, it's business, and you'll see friends, you'll have very pleasant evenings, wining and dining and going out. And I knew all the museums in the city well, but I had not a chance to get to the extraordinarily modern and ancient rich cultures and sites and civilization sites that abound in Anatolia and around the city. And on this occasion, I was able to do two simultaneously. I was able to visit the city of Troy, where with Irish luck, I stumbled into a wonderful guide who was taking some American group around, and I just attached myself to them, and he and they were very laid back. And after 4 hours running around with them, it was obviously an elderly, very wealthy, well-connected group. I went up to the guide and said to him, this was just wonderful. This is, of all the archaeological sites I visited, you have a mastery on this that I've never come across. You know, is there anything I can do to help you? And he said, I don't think I need your help, sir, but I would be in a bad way if I didn't know this site, because I'm the director of the Harvard University archaeological expedition digging up Troy at the moment. And in fact, he's often featured on television documentaries on Troy. And it was a joy to run around with him. But of course, Troy is very close to the site of Gallipoli. And I visited Gallipoli too. And it was a revelation to me, because Winston Churchill was a very colorful and talented writer. At his worst, and we will go into both his best and the worst of his writing in this session. At his worst, he's 19th century pompous imperial Macaulay British triumphalist prose. And even at the time, it was laughed at. You choke on it, it's impossible to take. Evelyn Waugh thought, who was certainly the greatest British fictional writer of the past century, and I think since Dickens. And I enormously recommend to everyone here, if you don't know Waugh, go to him. And as a journalist, I say, start with Scoop, which is the funniest and most cynical and wisest novel of British journalists that play, of any journalists that play and work that you can ever come across. Start with Scoop. But anyone here remember Brideshead Revisited, TV series? That's Evelyn Waugh too. Point is, Waugh is a master of English prose in the tradition of Mark Twain and in the tradition of George Orwell. Beautifully simple, sharp, clear, concise, elliptic. More significant for what he leaves out than what he puts in every sentence. A Waugh novel has to be savored. It's like an exquisite French gourmet dinner. It's exquisite. You cannot eat it quickly. You cannot digest it quickly. Churchill is the opposite in his prose. But Churchill knows how to tell a story. And at his best, Churchill carries you along with him. And the culmination of this narrative gift is in the great speeches warning against appeasement in the 1930s, and most of all of the rallying of the British in the face of what ought to have been inevitable and catastrophic defeat at the hands of the darkest regime in human history, facing Nazi Germany in 1940. So, and this is the Churchill we remember, and it's a true Churchill. But it's only, it's as if you have a mountain built of marble and gold, but also of garbage. And on the top of the mountain, there's a shining light. And this is the life and achievement of Winston Churchill. We remember him because of the genuine shining light of 1940. But we don't remember him for the chaos and confusion and incompetence and irony that went before and came afterwards. Matt, in one of our recent lectures, was good enough to pay tribute to more than I deserved, when I was tackling another titan, Abraham Lincoln, that there are myths of Lincoln that he's an evil, deep monster who puts the country into civil war needlessly, wants to be a tyrant. And the other one is even more ludicrous, much more ludicrous, that he's this wonderful, Carl Sandburg, that Lincoln is this wonderful, sweet saint. The Jesus of the Midwest, the suffering servant of the prairie, right? Utterly pure, utterly high-minded. My God, if he was that, we would have lost the Civil War on the very first day. Or we would have, did Lincoln hesitate at bloodbaths? Not for a second. Neither did Churchill, as we shall see. But Lincoln is remembered because of his crowning genius. And of course, Lincoln's rhetoric, as well as the political cynicism, covers up his endless military bungles and political bungles. If he was truly a political genius from the word go, we would have avoided secession. If he was a military genius, there would not have been 500,000 Union dead before Grant rides to the rescue in 1864 from the West. And it takes him 4 years and half a dozen of the worst generals in world history, every one of them having their ass whipped by Robert E. Lee and the inferior army of Northern Virginia, before Lincoln finally gets to Grant. Why didn't he get to Grant in 1862 when Grant had already won the first great victory of the Civil War at Fort Donelson? It takes him another 2 years to get there. We'll see similar conundrums now with Churchill. But back year 2000, I'm already mature, as the saying goes. I'm not young. And I visit the battlefields of Gallipoli. And in particular, I visit the site of the Battle of Suvla Bay, which in Winston Churchill's World Crisis, the book which we shall come to again and again here, Churchill describes this in wonderful dramatic terms. No military novelist is exciting to read on battles as Churchill is when he's really on full form, right? The gallant Australian soldiers charge up the impossible heights of Suvla Hill in Gallipoli against overwhelming odds against the Turkish army firing down on them with machine guns, and they take the top 20 times, and every time the Turks push them back. And if only the Australians had been able to go up one more time, they would have taken the hill. The way to Constantinople would have been open. The straits of the Dardanelles would have been open to the Allies. Turkey would have been forced to surrender, and all of a sudden the British and the French could have supplied Russia with all the guns and ammunition that they needed to stop the Germans and the Russian Civil War and the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the whole history of communism would never have happened. This is the genius prophet Churchill talking about the Battle of Suvla Bay in 1915. Isn't that exciting? Isn't it convincing? Don't you hang on every word of it? There's only one problem. It's a lie. It's ridiculous. It doesn't exist. Because when you go up to the top of the heights at Suvla Bay, as I bothered to do, and it seems that not a single admirer of Churchill has ever done. Of course, they don't want to and they don't need to, because when you have a prophet and when you have a God, you don't need to go and see things for yourself. You've got it all perfectly already. Facts are just dirty, inconvenient facts that get in the way of the bright, blazing light glow. And I went there. And what did I see? I saw more impenetrable territory. That even with the military technology of World War II or today, even today, you could not get through unless you had hovercraft and helicopters and limitless precision weapons. In World War II, that territory, as we shall see, stopped Churchill's armies dead in their tracks in Italy for 2 whole years. And he threw away hundreds of thousands of lives, even in World War II, again and again. And we only won because the Russians really won the war, and because Eisenhower and General Marshall and Franklin Roosevelt quickly developed the excellent judgment not to trust a word Winston Churchill said. Don't hear that very often, do you? Yet it is there. It is documented. It is in the official governments and historical records. But people don't want to believe it, and they don't want to see it. Why? Because what is the myth of World War II? The myth of World War II is Winston Churchill, this great warlord, this great experienced military commander, this military genius, right? And he tells naive, sweet, innocent, well-meaning, but utterly feckless and Franklin Roosevelt what to do. This is the British myth of World War II, and they love it. And again, there's only one problem with it. It's a total lie. It is the opposite of the truth. Franklin Roosevelt was the supreme warlord of World War II. He pulverized the Japanese. He ran rings around Hitler. He matched even Stalin and made his alliances with Stalin not out of naivety, but out of recognition that it was the Soviet Red Army that was winning the war, and the best the United States could do was to keep the Soviet Union in the fight. Otherwise, multiple millions of American and Canadian and British boys would die needlessly. Franklin Roosevelt did not just save American lives, he saved British lives and Canadian lives and infinitely other lives as well. Churchill did none of those things. He threw British lives away. Here is the irony. We remember Churchill as the great exemplar of the British Empire, and for Churchill, the greatest tragedy in history was the end of the British Empire. It broke his heart, as we shall see. He lived in terminal depression for the last 10 years of his life because the empire was gone. But why did the empire go? It was not World War II. What destroyed the British Empire was the catastrophic bloodletting of World War I, a war that shouldn't have been fought at all. But when it was fought, Britain never had to go in. And if Britain had not gone in, Germany would have won the war within 3 months, as it almost did anyway. And it was a very different Germany from World War II. It was a civilized Germany. It was a decent Germany. It was not the monster pseudo-Nazi Germany it was later falsely claimed to be. And this is crucially important to our understanding as well. But it was only that Britain was run by a liberal government which was in favor of peace on principle everywhere in 1914. And it was only a cabal of 4 men, no ladies among them, 4 men in the British government who took the crucial decision and pushed it through against their own dominant ruling Liberal Party in Parliament to put Britain into the war. And Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, the most powerful and operationally active political chief the British Royal Navy ever had, was one of those 4 men. Now, we shall start with World War I. We'll probably spend more time on it than on World War II, because Churchill in World War II, his bungles as well as his achievements, enormously well known. And even there, we have some surprises. But the World War I story is totally forgotten. And if you need to understand why even Churchill's wisest warnings of the 1930s were ignored at the time, you have to remember that it's only 20 years after World War I, and Britain was still full of millions of people who had lost beloved family members in their millions in the war that Churchill started, and specifically in the battles that Churchill demanded and insisted and forced through to be fought. As late as the 1920s, Churchill's beloved son, Randolph, but not his only son. There was, as we shall see more controversially in this presentation as well. Randolph Churchill was sent to Harrow Public School, just as his father had gone before him. And it's a boarding school away from home. I think it's a ridiculous and savage system that traumatizes the ruling class of the British needlessly. And actually, one of my favorite historians, who I often cite in these presentations, Lord Corelli Barnett, maintains in The Collapse of British Power that the British public school system and the conformity which the boys, was not even imposed on the boys by their teachers, being boys, left to themselves without families and parents around them, they became conformist among themselves. And Randolph Churchill at school was deeply miserable because other boys kept beating him up endlessly for one reason. He was always told the reason: your father killed my father at the Dardanelles. My father was in the British Army or in the Royal Navy, and he was with the Australian or New Zealand forces, and he was killed at Gallipoli. And this is why Churchill writes his memoirs in the 1920s, The World Crisis. when the first volume of the book came out, because boy, Churchill could write and boy, Churchill could tell a tale, Lady Asquith, the widow of Henry Herbert Asquith, Margot Asquith, the widow of the prime minister he served before and during World War I, described the book this way. Winston has written a history of the universe and called it the world. Has written a book about himself and called it a wonderful, endless, enormous book about himself and called it the world crisis. Lord Balfour heard that and improved upon it. Balfour said, and Balfour was the catastrophic prime minister, but a very shrewd and ruthless and very, on behalf of the British Empire, very effective intellectual, forceful leader indeed. When Balfour came into my studies, the British view on Balfour is shaped by Churchill, as so many views are, and therefore is completely false, as so many of Churchill's prejudices are. It is that Balfour was effete, philosopher, soft, too humane, indecisive, one of these people who is too soft for this world, too sweet and idealistic for this world. As is so often the case, the opposite is the case. He was known in Ireland as Bloody Balfour when he was British Minister for Ireland in the 1880s, and he crushed the latest wave. The Irish, like the Palestinian state, you could not keep them down, because if you treat it's the same old story. If you treat people endlessly like dirt, they will endlessly cause trouble for you and rise up against you in outrage. And this was the problem the British had in Ireland again and again and again. And Churchill, as we shall see, had it in Ireland too. But he writes a book, and it's enormous. There are 8 volumes in the final book. It is a book, a history of World War I and the world as it was as it settled down, if it ever settled down at all, in the years after World War I. There are 2 volumes of the book which are absolutely marvelous, because he has almost no role himself in those volumes. They are the Eastern Front, which is so brilliant. And again, you must not underestimate Churchill, as we shall see. He was responsible for some of the biggest catastrophes in British history. He could be a raving idiot, but he had enormous force of personality, and he had a strange prophetic vision. He repeatedly could see what the future was going to be, even when he was responsible for bungling that future himself. As early as 1910, when he is Home Secretary, nothing to do with the military at all, but he has a military background. He'd served in the British Army in the 1890s. He was obsessed with glory. He'd written in the cavalry. He'd written in the last major cavalry charge of the British Army at Omdurman, when 60,000 Sudanese are massacred in a single day by Lord Kitchener's army. And Churchill is actually a relative liberal at the time. He outrages Kitchener, the top British general, by being a liberal dissident reporter. He says Kitchener shot prisoners out of hand in their thousands, which he did, of course. And he humiliated and burned and desecrated the tens of thousands of Sudanese Muslim dead warriors. And this was shameful, and they were honorable and brave men. And Churchill writes this in the major newspapers in London, and he gets away with writing it because he is an aristocrat himself. He is the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough. He is the son of one of the most beautiful women in Victorian England, who had been a mistress for many years of the future King Edward VII. Churchill is not the son of King Edward VII. They had very, cautious relations. Edward VII was repeatedly doing favors for Churchill while he couldn't stand him, because Churchill's mother had been one of his favorite mistresses. This is how intimate and complex the relations of the British ruling class were at the beginning of the 20th century and thereafter, as long as there was a British ruling class. There wasn't one after 1945. Churchill's own bungles and sellouts guaranteed this, as we shall see. But just this morning, I actually made a framework for this lecture, and heaven knows if I will actually stick to my framework. But the volume of material on Winston Churchill is so enormous that you can't just let yourself get lost in it and wander in it. You've got to start somewhere. But even this morning, I actually, again, the value of starting the day with a strong 20-ounce caffeine kick of coffee never fails. It struck me that the last lecture that I gave to you, that Matt generously put me into, was in Ulysses S. Grant. And I even mentioned Churchill there because in Churchill's history, largely unreadable, and if you don't believe me, read it for yourself and see how far you want to get with it, his history of the English-speaking peoples. He reveres, the book comes to life in the American Civil War because Churchill reveres the Confederacy and Churchill reveres Robert E. Lee. And he has no time for the champion of the Union, the champion of democracy, the champion of the abolition of slavery and the establishment of human rights whatsoever. None. Because Churchill is a Democrat, but that comes second to him being a British imperialist. Again and again and again, as we are going to see. It's deeper than that. Because I realized over my coffee this morning that going from Grant to Churchill, Matt had set up a wonderful synergy for me again, yet again, because Grant is almost always overlooked and is regarded as a boring nonentity, whereas Churchill is seen as a universal genius. And both of them are the photographic opposites of this myth. And actually, both of them belong together. They are bookends, yin and yang, positive and negative. They set each other off. Because Grant is the beginning of the industrial age and the rise of industrial mass democracy in the world. And he is a general of genius, and yet he is the most taciturn of men in speech. Yet in writing, he is the most compelling of men. His memoir, a man who never was remembered for more than 2 or 3 words at a time. As I mentioned before, Battle of Shiloh, 20,000 men killed in a single day. Grant's best friend, General William Tecumseh Sherman, to Grant. Well, Grant, we sure took a licking today, didn't we? Devil's own day we had. Grant's reply after a day of catastrophe, the bloodiest day in Western military history, till the first day of the Battle of the Somme, more than half a century later. And what does Grant say? Sure did. Whip him tomorrow, though. By contrast, Churchill pours out the prose like ink pouring out of a squid when in reaction to any disaster or catastrophe. Churchill again and again, as the great British historian Carradine, I think David Carradine, points out, uses rhetoric, uses language, and most of all uses his writing to cover up his own endless bungles. 1944, towards the end of the war, it's already very clear that we have won the war against Hitler, and Churchill's role in this was huge, mixed but huge, and his son Randolph says to him, Papa, how do you think history will treat you when all of this is over? And Churchill replies with his best wit and honesty and cynicism, why, Randolph, it will treat me very well, of course, for I shall write it. You see, he'd done this before. The World Crisis is 8 volumes, each one of them 400 to 600 pages long, 8 volumes from 1911 to 1920. The volume on the Eastern Front in World War I is the best book of its kind that is written in English for the next 60 years, till the very fine and now sadly departed British historian Norman Stone wrote his classic work, The Eastern Front, in 1975. That's how good it is, even as a work of history. And Churchill tells the truth as far as it can be told, because he doesn't have anything to cover and hide. But when it comes to his own record in World War I, he has everything to cover and hide, or rather explain away. Because there are 2 Churchills in World War I. There was the Churchill we remember, the heroic First Lord of the Admiralty, the gallant, fighting, fearless head of the British Navy. All that is true. from 1914 to 1915. He was the most hands-on, energetic, dynamic political head the Royal Navy ever had. And the result was catastrophe, repeatedly. At the beginning of the war, September 1914, 3 large British armored cruisers are sent on direct orders of Churchill and his first Sea Lord, a man we shall come to again and again, another weird, erratic genius who is basically a dangerous, mad lunatic and idiot, but who is revered in history, Sir John Jackie Fisher, later Lord Fisher. First Sea Lord. Curiously, he and Churchill are both in one of the most racist and exclusive societies in history. They're both outsiders because Churchill is half American. His mother, as I say, one of the most beautiful women in England in the 19th century, a mistress of King Edward VII, is the daughter of a wealthy New York financier. And the American dimension and the awareness of America already in World War I, as we shall see, is crucial to Churchill. It is crucial to saving Britain and saving Europe and the world in World War II, the fact that he is half American. And he is despised in Britain and distrusted by the ruling class, not at first, but in the 1920s and 30s as a half American adventurer. We shall see why. Not just because of the relationship with his mother, there's much more to it than that. But in that, he's head of the Royal Navy. He loves his toy and pet battleships. He has flattered the Prime Minister, who is his protector, Lord Asquith, so much that although by this point happily married, he spends an excessive amount of time with a woman who he may have had intimate relationships with and probably did not, because he wouldn't have risked it. Because she was the daughter of the Prime Minister, but they remained lifelong friends, and it's a very important relationship because her name is Violet Bonham Carter. She is the daughter of Prime Minister Henry Herbert Asquith. She is the mother of the wonderful, beautiful, and brilliant and talented, all of which they both were, movie actress Helena Bonham Carter, A Room with a View, who even now is being named as possibly the next Doctor Who. And I think she would be as wonderful in the role as the terrible actress Jodie Whittaker, who's playing her at the moment, is terrible. But Helena Bonham Carter is a brilliant talent. And her great-grandmother was one of the great political grandees of the British Empire. She lived into her mid-80s. She ended her amazingly long literary and political career as a director of the British Broadcasting Corporation for 30 years, no less. But she also wrote an adoring and critical book on Churchill, but it's also one of the most fun books and entertaining and in its own way revealing books on Churchill. It is called Winston Churchill as I Knew Him. And in this book, Violet Bonham Carter writes about how she met Churchill for the first time. It was after the Liberal landslide victory in 1905. Churchill was a conservative, the son of a conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. His father, Randolph, an unprincipled demagogue and quite mad, was also one of the great creators of what was called Tory democracy. It continues to this day. Boris Johnson is an exemplar of it. It's basically British populism conning the working classes into supporting an imperial policy based on emotion rather than their own best interests. Does that sound familiar? I think it sounds very familiar. And yet, although Churchill's father was a founder of the modern Conservative Party, Churchill leaves the Conservative Party to join the Liberal Party in 1904. Why does he leave? Firstly, because the Conservative Party have treated his father, who had died very young of syphilis at age 46, very badly, and Churchill adored his father, even though his father always despised him and abused him. His father was convinced Churchill would come to nothing. Churchill later in life writes a wonderful short story based on a dream he has to this effect. If time permits, we should come to that too. It is quite extraordinary, enormously revealing, and actually very moving and sweet, believe it or not. And sweetness is not a term you usually associate, I assure you, with the real Winston Churchill. But Churchill leaves the Conservative Party of his father to join the Liberal Party. What is the real reason? Why, it's simple. He knows the Conservative Party under Balfour is heading for a catastrophic defeat, and the Liberals will be running Britain and the British Empire for the next 10 years at least, maybe forever. So he wants to be with the winners. So he joins them. And we will see this pattern of cynical opportunism in his relations with Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin as well. We shall even see them there. So he leaves the Conservatives. The Conservatives regard him as a traitor. He joins the Liberals. And the Liberals don't know what to do with him because Churchill is energetic. And Churchill, in fact, starts out as one of the leading reformers in the history of Britain. He supports David Lloyd George in the creation of a welfare state in Britain, or the beginnings of it. In terms of bringing in social security 25 years before FDR brings it in against impossible odds in America, David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, his closest political friend and ally, bring in a parallel system of social security, which is much more advanced than America will have in the 1950s in Britain, before World War I. He creates, with Lloyd George, old age insurance, also for government state pensions for elderly people. This is not new in the world. It had been pioneered by that great evil creature of darkness, if you believe British liberal historiography, Otto von Bismarck in Germany. 30 years before, in the 1880s. In 1880, Bismarck, in alliance with the National Liberals in Germany, solves all the main social pathologies plaguing industrial societies in the world, and the British did not begin to follow him for 30 years, and America did not begin to follow him for 50 years, and to this day, America and Britain have still not followed the far more humane and efficient German system of national health system, which is vastly superior to the ghastly bloated British one, or the enormously expensive and far too patchy American one, as we well know. Yet Churchill was on the side of the angels in social reform before World War I, having been a prisoner of war himself in the Boer War. He knew how depressing life in jail was. And he is one of the great pioneers of social reform and improving the conditions and lives of prisoners in British jails during World War I. Now, this is the side of Churchill that to his credit, he never loses. He's always, when he rejoins the Conservative Party, one of the reasons he's seen as an outsider is, well, he's still a liberal at heart, isn't he? He wants to give away too much money to the poor and to the unemployed. And that was true. But there's another side to Churchill, his military side. As I say, he'd been a soldier in the 1890s. He'd gone through Sandhurst. His knowledge of military affairs is basically those of a cavalryman, and a not very bright one, in the 1890s. But he has another something to him, what Violet Bonham Carter calls a zigzag flash of lightning through the brain. It's not rational. In 1910, he writes a memoir to the Committee for the Imperial Defense, which has just been set up to deal with what is seen as the new rising threat to Britain, and it's already seen as an existential threat from Germany. The huge mistake this was not just the evils of the British Empire. The great mistake Kaiser Wilhelm II made, listening to Grand Admiral von Tirpitz, was to create a large German high seas fleet that could challenge the British at sea. Now, Germany actually had reason to do so, because the British blockade in World War I was a monstrous war crime that killed 750,000 German civilians, largely elderly people, children, and women. But British propaganda smothered this side of the blockade, in America in particular. So when the Germans turned to U-boat warfare in 1917 to try and do to the British what the British had already been doing to them successfully for 3 years, starving an entire civilian population to death, it's presented as a terrible German war crime that creates new horrors in the world, when the long-suffering Germans were only responding too little and too late to a monstrous war crime that Churchill had designed for them and drawn up for them in 1914, and that was continued to be implemented by his successors afterwards. It's also central to why the Nazis were determined to conquer Europe for Lebensraum, for living space in World War II, and why they plundered all the nations of occupied Europe in World War II, because the German attitude there was, we played by the rules in World War I, and we lost the war anyway, and 750,000 of our most innocent and vulnerable people starved to death by the British. So why shouldn't we take what we need from the allies of the British this second time around? You can only understand so much of World War II in the context of World War I. But during World War I, Churchill, first of all, sends a battleship on meaningless maneuvers that his admirals oppose in the Irish Sea. It is sunk by a U-boat. He refuses to heed warnings from local naval commanders that he is sending 3 large heavy cruisers into the middle of the North Sea within range of German submarines, because Churchill knows wars are won by battleships. Submarines have nothing to do with it. They're useless, they're harmless, they can't do anything. And all those 3 cruisers are sunk in the space of a single hour together. They have no anti-submarine protection or alert deployment whatsoever. They are deployed without any protective screen whatsoever. It's a level of incompetence against submarine warfare that is only equaled by the Japanese against our US submarines in World War II. 1,400 sailors go on the spot. Churchill sends a British squadron of warships, too old, too slow, and too weak, and commanded by an admiral he likes, Admiral Craddock, a brainless, gung-ho, hard-charging cavalry-type officer, a brainless fool. You will see again and again, Churchill loves these kinds of people and appoints them again and again to the top naval and military commands, and thousands and tens of thousands of men die needlessly every time we're result of it. The result of this is the Battle of Coronel off Santiago, Chile in the fall of 1914. 2 British heavy cruisers are sunk in a single day. 1,000 more British soldiers are killed. And all of a sudden, Germany has control of the Eastern Pacific Ocean and the entire South Atlantic, because they have a battle squadron there and the British do not. Churchill has thrown away naval dominance over half the world. Churchill and Fisher, who are responsible for this disastrous bungle, overcompensate. In war, it's always better to overcompensate than to undercompensate, and this works. They sent 2 new high-speed, heavily armed battle cruisers. Fisher's designed his pride and joy, and Churchill loves them too. They both love high-speed battle cruisers, the same gun weaponry capabilities and armaments as battleships, but far faster than battleships. Seems the best of both worlds. Well, there's a drawback to it, as we shall see in a little while, but it works at 1914. Round the Cape of Good Hope, round the tip of South America, when Spee comes, because he's determined to complete his victory by taking over the British coaling and naval base in the Falkland Islands, where the British also fought a war in 1982, you may recall. And the British have worked out that's where he's going to go. So they send Admiral Sturdy and the battle cruisers, Invincible and Inflexible, down there. And because they're so fast, they beat von Spee to the punch. So when the German squadron gets there, it goes into a trap and it's sunk in a single day. So Churchill is able to represent this as a kind of like crime and punishment, law and order. The great crime is the sinking of the British cruisers at Coronel. How dare they? But the big bad Germans are then hunted down and destroyed themselves a couple of months later at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. And British maritime domination over South America is restored as it should always have been in the first place. A happy ending to the story for the British public, right? But it was his own bungling that put it there in the first place. In 1915, his biggest bungles come. He brings Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, which is still so vast that its territories are half covering the entire Middle East. It controls, as well as Turkey, modern Iraq, modern Syria, modern Jordan, modern Israel and Palestine, Egypt, and most of Arabia. And Churchill brings them in on the side of the Germans, because Churchill is hungry for battleships. Britain has more battleships than it knows what to do with it, but they're also building 2 battleships for the Turkish Navy. Churchill orders the battleships seized in the shipyards where they're being built and turned over to the Royal Navy instead. They don't even bother paying any compensation to the Turks. The Turkish people, one of the great imperial nations of the world for the previous 800 years, are outraged by this. They join Germany and Austria. A war that might have ended in 1915-16 is going to last for another 3 years, and what would have been open supply routes to supply Russia through the Dardanelles, Turkey, if Turkey was neutral and friendly to Britain, instead is cut off because Winston Churchill is a bungling idiot. Even now, the Turks hesitate to join the Germans because they know the power of the British Navy, and they have no modern ships of their own, and the British have just seized their 2 battleships. What do the Germans do? The German government offers Turkey a modern battle cruiser already operating in the Mediterranean called the Emden, E-M-D-E-N. The British know it's there. The British intercept the signals. The British outnumber the Emden in the Mediterranean, along with the French allies, by a factor of 30 to 1. The Emden, to make things even worse, is off Sicily. It is in the Straits of Messina. The British have cruiser forces to seal both ends of the Straits of Messina. But Churchill bungles the message to his commanding admiral on the spot, Admiral Trowbridge. And as a result, the British only safeguard the harmless western end of the strait with all their ships, far more than they need, and they don't put any ships to guard the eastern end of the strait. So the Emden sails straight out and goes straight to Constantinople, bringing with it, as Churchill, with his wonderful gift for language to cover up his bungles, again says, bringing endless suffering, tragedy, and war to the peoples of the East. Indeed it did, but because he had bungled it. So Turkey joins the war, but not to worry. Churchill has yet another brilliant conception. He will send battleships of the Royal Navy with some French ships up the Dardanelles Straits, the Bosphorus, to bombard the capital of the Turkish Empire, the great city of Constantinople itself. The imperial city will immediately fall to Britain's guns, and they send them. But again, there is a little problem. The Germans are supporting the Turks and are fortifying, putting guns to control the straits as quickly as possible. Even that isn't remotely enough because the British have ships, battleships, and they can move fast. But Churchill has forgot one small, unimportant detail. Mines, what we today call in America improvised explosive devices at sea, right? The Turks very sensibly put mines in their own waters. The British ignore, Churchill especially, doesn't send adequate light ships, small light ships, undramatic ships. We see this again and again in Churchill's conduct of war. Hitler actually made the same mistake. They both want the biggest weapons, the best. They ignore the little weapons, the unimportant things, the maintenance, the detail that win wars. They're ignorant of them. They don't have a clue. And this Churchill eerily echoes Hitler. He echoes him. So they don't have any minesweepers. They don't have any mine detection devices. And 3 British battleships are sunk in 1 hour. And another 3,000 or so British sailors lose their lives. So you cannot get up the, and Churchill, instead of taking responsibility himself, of course, blames his own admiral for not throwing any more battleships at the problem and not throwing away thousands more lives. We'll see this again and again. Einstein says the definition of stupidity. The definition of stupidity is to do the same thing again and again and again, even when it results in the same thing. Hitler does this through World War II when he keeps telling his generals, who, when it comes to maneuver, are the best generals in the world, still can run rings around the best American, British, and Soviet generals, except Hitler shackles them. He says you must never retreat from a position for any reason at all. So he traps the German army again and again in fixed positions. Churchill is the same, except his obsession is, oh, always attack, always attack, always be bold, always be bold. Of course, it's not his life he's throwing away, it's everybody else's lives. It's a very neocon position. For a long time, I wondered in my innocence why repulsive idiots like the neoconservatives in America kept throwing us into wars against the whole Muslim and Arab world, which were completely unnecessary. And of course, they never went themselves. And how could they worship the gallant Winston Churchill at the same time? What I didn't realize, of course, was that they were like attracts like. Churchill was as contemptible and stupid as the neocons who worship him today are. Like attracts like. It's in the Bible, book of Proverbs. How do you tell whether a king will turn out, or queen will turn out good or badly? What are their advisors like? Who do they hang out with? Who are their friends? I mean, we don't have to worry about it in this group because we all hang out with each other, right? So we're a great influence on each other. You can tell how each of us are as individuals, what our values are, by looking at all of us, by looking at who we associate with. And we shall see this pattern with Winston Churchill developing too. So, since the sea campaign against Turkey at Gallipoli has failed, Churchill switches to a land campaign. The top British generals, led by Lord Kitchener, do not want to do it. A lot of lies are pumped out to this day that it was really Kitchener's campaign, that Churchill had nothing to do with the land campaign. All of it is nonsense. The land commander at Gallipoli is actually a personal close friend and favorite of Churchill, who was in the Umdurman campaign with him, slaughtering tens of thousands of Africans perfectly happily back in 1895. And he's an idiot. By contrast, the Turks have two very interesting generals. One is a German Jew, Lehman von Sanders, whose cousins improbably at the same time are building one of the largest chains of department stores in the state of Texas, which flourishes to this day. And Lehman himself, because he's Jewish, is not allowed to have a plum command, a favorite command on the Western Front or the Eastern Front against Russia or Britain and France. He's not allowed to show up against the A-team. But he manages, because he's such a brilliant guy, he gets to the top anyway, and he whips the ass of the British Empire forces in Gallipoli. But they have to land there first. The landings at D-Day in 1944 are justly celebrated as an extraordinary example of planning, advanced technology, and also driven by Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, the great British commander, who we'll come back to as well, Bernard Montgomery. They care for their men. They care for their soldiers. There is none of this at Gallipoli. Churchill has the young Australian and New Zealand divisions landing at Gallipoli. They don't land in armored, metal protected, powered landing craft. You know, you look at any picture of any landing by the Allies in World War II, and most of all, you look at D-Day. And what do you think of? You see all these squat metal landing craft, thousands of them, going out from the big ships and protecting the soldiers on them from bullets, and then landing and opening up their doors, and tanks roll straight off them onto the shores of the beaches of Normandy, right? And that is the way it was. But at Gallipoli, Churchill sends 50,000 men ashore in wooden rowing boats that they have to row with oars, right? And there is no protection whatsoever against even small arms fire or light rifle fire. And the seas off the beaches of Gallipoli run red with the blood of young Australian and New Zealand soldiers in their thousands, because Churchill hasn't thought it through. He thinks you can land people ashore just the way his heroes did 100 years before in the Napoleonic Wars. And again, we'll see in World War I, Churchill still thinks it's the Napoleonic Wars. And in World War II, we shall see, he still thinks it's the Napoleonic Wars. He doesn't have a clue, and he never learns. He never learns. Now, Grant, of course, never makes great rousing speeches in the Civil War, but he adapts to changing circumstances as soon as they happen. He makes many mistakes, and he learns from all of them, and Grant never repeats a single mistake. When he cannot take Robert E. Lee's defenses at Cold Harbor by force and surprise in the late summer and fall of 1864. What does Grant do? He does something that fills all the instant geniuses and neocons of the day sitting behind their safe desks in New York City and Boston and Washington, writing newspaper articles with horror. He invents modern siege warfare. He invents trench warfare to protect the lives of his own men, and it works. He pins Robert E. Lee down in the lines around St. Petersburg with the Army of Northern Virginia, while his own trusted right-hand man and Deputy General William Tecumseh Sherman rolls up the entire rest of the Confederacy, going from Georgia through Atlanta to the Carolinas to the sea. And they win the war because Grant adapts to changing circumstances and Churchill never does. Gallipoli becomes a catastrophe. 250,000 Allied boys, mainly Australians and New Zealanders, die at Gallipoli. And then the forces have to be withdrawn anyway. It is the bloodiest loss of the war to this point. It dwarfs all the other Allied victories and defeats. But Churchill, as always, is lucky because the commanders on the Western Front are butchers, the British commanders especially, and the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and the Third Battle of Ypres, which the British call Wipers, the local Flemish name is Passchendaele, in 1917, can kill between them more than 3 times as many British soldiers as even Gallipoli killed. An entire British generation dies on the Western Front and at Gallipoli. As the great British novelist C.S. Forester says in his novel, The General, young British men were dying at a faster rate than at any time in the 600 years since the Black Death. And they didn't know how to stop it. Churchill is forced out of the Admiralty. He is forced out of the top of the British imperial government. His wife, Clementine, says, when he lost the Admiralty, I thought he would die of grief. Churchill is not actually suicidal, but he is prone all his life to the deepest of depressions. He calls it the black dog. And he falls into it in a very deep and intense way here. Eventually, he crawls out of it a bit, and he is a brave man. He volunteers to be an officer on the Western Front. Being Churchill, of course, he wants to be a general. Nothing less will satisfy him. But after his already record, the British Army will not risk him with that, just as the American Army rightly did not let Theodore Roosevelt become a general of cavalry on the Western Front. They knew they would have been throwing away thousands of lives for no reason whatsoever. And for all their other stupidities they have, the British generals in World War I at least have enough common sense and wit not to put Winston Churchill in command of an army. They do have that. So he becomes a colonel. He commands a battalion. He wants to command a regiment, but is never allowed to do so. He serves on the Western Front for 3 or 4 months. It's a time which is enormously exaggerated in public myth today, of course, and over the past 75, 80 years. He was not beloved by his men. They despise him. He did not mix with them. He did not have the popular touch. His own officers disliked and distrusted him. He was basically competent. He lived in luxury. He had his wife still send him from Fortnum and Mason's, the main elite delicatessen for the British Empire in those days, an endless supply of luxury meals. Most important of all, as we shall get to in future, the alcohol supply was still widely flowing and uninhibited. But it was a quiet time on the front, and he wasn't notorious for any particular bungles, and he still holds a seat in Parliament. He wasn't idealistic enough to give that up, and he certainly never felt guilty. And after 3 or 4 months there, he comes back to London. And of course, it's been a marvelous career move for him because other generals are killing British boys at an even faster rate than he had done before. So his bungles have been forgotten because of the even bigger bungles of his successors. And at least he'd served on the Western Front, and nobody else had. So he actually has a degree of supposed experience in fighting in the war that nobody else in Parliament does. But most of all, he is Churchill. He is the opposite of Grant. Grant cannot give a speech to save his life, but put him in charge of the most impossible military situations of every kind, or make him president of the United States, or put him in charge of the great issues of peace and war. And Ulysses S. Grant delivers spectacularly well every time, and he does so subtly that people don't even realize he's responsible for it. Churchill, by contrast, is responsible for no achievements, but he speaks and writes well, and he's an important critical voice in Parliament. Even his own best friend in politics, David Lloyd George, who becomes the war prime minister in 1916, does not appoint Churchill to his government. Churchill later says that the day when Lloyd George passed him over and would not appoint him into his own government was the worst day of his life, the greatest disappointment of his life. Not throwing away all those lives at Gallipoli or anywhere else, being passed over for a cabinet appointment at the height of the war. So he becomes a pain in the ass to his best friend. He becomes a critic of him for the next year. And in mid-1917, Lloyd George does what so many politicians have done since then and before him too. And it's a very political thing to do. It's a calculation. Sometimes it's brilliant and sometimes it's disastrous. And it works very well for Lloyd George. You can either have someone, with apologies to the ladies present for the crudity of the term, but it does, I think, describe the dilemma. Do you have someone peeing into a tent from the outside, or do you have somebody who's an insider who will still pee all the time but pee outside? In other words, do you make this guy who was a pain in the behind to you, criticizing your government endlessly, which is Churchill, do you bring him into the government, knowing he'll be an endless nuisance and probably a menace in the government, but at least you can control him and silence him a bit? Or do you let him go on attacking you from the outside? Well, Lloyd George cannot afford to let Churchill attack him from the outside because Lloyd George doesn't have a clue how to win the war either. None of them do, right? So what does he do? He does not give Churchill one of the war service departments he craves, because he quite rightly will not let Churchill near creating another battle or another military campaign or sinking another battle fleet. He will not let him near doing any of those things. He makes him Minister of Munitions, a thankless job, but the most crucial one in the government. The job that ensures that the British Army in France will never, however bungled its military campaigns, will never run out of shells or bullets or machine guns or heavy artillery with which to fight them. Churchill later says of his year and a half at the Ministry of Munitions, we were told we would fail. We were told we would run out of this and we would run out of that. Until in the end, the only thing we ran out of was Germans. Churchill is very much a racist, but he has favorites. He's not a simple black and white racist. He has he hates German people. He just does. He loves the French wildly, as we shall see again in the 1930s. He is one of the 4 individuals responsible for the decision to go to France's aid in 1914. That is the real decision that destroys the British Empire and throws away 2 million British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and Commonwealth lives in World War I. It did not have to be done. Ironically, the man who should have known best that it did not have to be done was Churchill himself. Churchill has equipped the world, is good at munitions. He's good at supply and equipment. He's brilliant at it. In 1910 and 1911, 1912, he approves the design of new oil-powered, turbine-driven, fast battleships to be the key strategic defense weapons of the British Navy. They're much faster than old-fashioned coal-fired, coal-driven, steam-powered battleships. Much faster, and they have a much larger range. What does that mean? It means Britain does not need to control the ports of the coast of France and Belgium to have perfect security against any power, whether it's France or Germany or anyone else controlling the continent. In other words, they don't have to go to war on behalf of Belgium to preserve their empire. Germany occupying the Belgian ports, which they do through both world wars, is not a primary threat to Britain. And Churchill, above all, people should know this, because he has been responsible for the decision to equip Britain with the fastest battleships they've got. There's only one problem with switching from coal to oil. Britain sits on mountains of coal, just as Germany does, but neither of them has oil. The drive for oil is why Germany has to conquer and occupy Romania in World War I, have Romania as an ally in World War II, and why Hitler drives all the way to the Caucasus in World War II, and why Hitler is an idiot for not supporting Field Marshal Rommel when Rommel could have delivered the oil of the Middle East to Hitler in 1942. But Hitler did not realize that last key point. Churchill knows that Britain doesn't have oil. Churchill has a similar approach. No problem. We'll just steal it from someone else. They steal it from Iran. They set up the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later understandably changes its name. But I think all of you, especially those of you living in the United States, but in Europe too, have heard of it. Have you ever heard of BP? British Petroleum, still one of the 5 or 6 largest oil corporations in the world to this day. It is the name rechanged of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that Winston Churchill set up in 1911 and 1912 to take control of the oil of Iran. And for the next 40 years, the oil of Iran is stolen from Iran by the British Empire to keep the Royal Navy the #1 fleet in the world. And it is all Winston Churchill's doing. And it works. It is not moral. It is not right. It is not just. And Churchill cares nothing about any of those things and never will. But it keeps the British Empire strong and supreme. And that he really does care about. What does it mean that Churchill is Britain's Minister of Munitions? It means that he is Britain's Albert Speer. What Albert Speer was to the Third Reich in 1942 to 1945, Churchill is to the British war effort in 1917 to 1918. He keeps, and all of a sudden the generals love him because he solves all their supply problems. They don't know what to do with the weapons he gives them. They're still throwing away hundreds of thousands of men in every major campaign, but they never run short of bullets. They never run short of rifles. They never run short of heavy artillery or the shells with which to fire them. And it is important for another reason, because the demands of war are so great that even the British industrial economy, which is the 2nd or 3rd largest in the world at the time, cannot satisfy them. Only the gigantic, magnificent American steel and industrial economy can satisfy those needs. So Churchill turns to an American industrialist. His name is Bernard Baruch. He remains for the next 30 years one of the key people in Churchill's life and one of the key architects of the Anglo-American relationship.
Is make them ahead of time.
Because Bernard Baruch is a financier who has enormous industrial holdings and is enormously adaptive. He will later be the victim of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about which nothing could be further from the truth, because while Baruch is Jewish, technically, he's totally assimilated. He has nothing to do with the Jewish community. His daughter, a lady well ahead of her time, is one of the leading equestriennes in America, and is also openly, not secretly, but openly gay, which since she is the daughter of one of the 10 richest men in America, she can get away with being, and is a pioneer both for gay rights and protection for gay women across the United States, and of equestrian affairs in the United States for the next 50 years. That's Baruch's daughter. And Baruch has nothing to do with the Jewish community. We will find in the 1930s and 40s, he has no interests worth the name in the rescue of threatened Jewish children or communities from either Germany or Poland. Another very improbable figure who Churchill has no interest in does, but Baruch and Churchill are close friends, and they are inseparable. Because first of all, Churchill, who does not have a great financial mind, helps make Baruch one of the wealthiest men on earth in World War I through the flood of industrial contracts which Britain desperately needs to create the ammunition, especially to win the war. And Baruch is the key figure in the US financial establishment in setting up those connections and selling them. And secondly, Baruch saves Churchill a decade later. Churchill speculates heavily on Wall Street in the 1920s. But Churchill is a terrible gambler, as we shall see again and again. Churchill plays poker with General Marshall and with Harry S. Truman on the train to Fulton, Missouri, when he gives the famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946. And Truman reveres Churchill. And Churchill has a huge influence on Truman. But Truman is a decent poker player. He's not a great poker player. His great weakness is that he's an insecure little guy who's a macho tough. So he always has to go charging into every situation rather than back down or look for a sensible compromise. He doesn't look for a shrewd, ruthless, and direct solution as Eisenhower would. He doesn't look for a brilliant, everyone wins solution like Franklin Roosevelt would. Truman is not a great poker player. Franklin Roosevelt is a magnificent poker player and fleeces everyone he plays, right? But Truman is a poor poker player. But Truman and his friends and colleagues discovered to their amazement that Winston Churchill, the great Churchill, is a terrible poker player, and they fleece him. So they immediately start deliberately losing, because this is Winston Churchill. This is the savior of world civilization. This is the hero of 1940. This is the guy who was just about to give them, in his Fulton, Missouri speech, the green light to go ahead with the Cold War. So they got to prop him up. But he's actually a terrible player. And so he's an awful guy. It's one of the reasons Churchill loves France. Where does he go when he's in France? He goes to the Riviera resorts where he can gamble. And he always loses big, and he always has enormous debts every time. But the biggest debts he incurs are in 1929, when he goes long, when all the shrewd players like Joe Kennedy are going short and they know a crash is coming. And Churchill, far from benefiting from the Wall Street crash, goes down with it. And he would have been totally wiped out and ruined, except for two very improbable men. One is Bernard Baruch, who bails him out of his worst debts. And this is, as usual, a typically shrewd, wise investment from Baruch, because Baruch and his industrial interests 10 years later will make new multiple billions of profits by supplying the British and French armies and navies with weapons, warships, and equipment at the beginning of World War II, a key driving factor in helping bring America out of the Great Depression. And who is First Lord of the Admiralty in 1939 for a second time? Who is a key figure once again in working with Baruch to make sure that this flow of weapons and ammunition and supplies from the United States starts off again? Why, it's Mr. Churchill again, of course, just as he was back in World War I. And finally, there is the most important lesson of all Churchill takes from his dealings with Bernard Baruch and the United States war economy in 1917 and 1918. And it is this. And I would say that Americans are not taking their own advice today. Anyone with any sanity today would bet on China and try and keep on good terms with China, because China is the most largest and advanced industrial economy in the world, and China is still rising. Will it have crises? Will it have problems? You bet your bippy it does. Everybody does. But China, everyone who has bet against China for the past 40 years has lost. Everyone who has bet on China has won. Churchill had the same key understanding from the 1916 and 17 onwards. The future of the world is in America. The industrial heart of the world is in America. Now, Neville Chamberlain does not understand this 20 years later. In 1939, when he has no interest in Churchill at all, President Franklin Roosevelt sends an extraordinary letter, not to Churchill, but to the man he is convinced correctly is going to be Britain's first war premier, Neville Chamberlain. My dear Mr. Chamberlain, I am very concerned. I paraphrase slightly, but look it up. This is the essence of it. My dear Mr. Chamberlain, I am very concerned about the drift of events in Europe. I think it would be extremely helpful to both our great nations if you and I remained in touch informally and let each other know of our mutual needs and ways in which we may be of service to each other. Yours very sincerely, your servant, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. An extraordinary letter for the leader of the most powerful nation in the world and the world's leading democracy, to say to the leader of the second most powerful nation as it appeared in the world to be, and the second most powerful democracy. And what is Chamberlain's response to this? He holds up the letter in a cabinet meeting And he jokes about it. He sneers at Franklin Roosevelt. He jokes about him. He belittles him. He's a fool. Chamberlain is a fool. When Churchill is appointed to the Admiralty, Roosevelt, who of course is no fool at all, writes a similar note to Churchill. Now, the two men had met before, and the occasion was not a happy one. According to myth, you know, great leaders, you know, soulmates in war, as soon as we meet, you know, it's like falling in love, click and that's it. Well, very often it can be. I've experienced it. Most other people have, I think. But sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes love and even defining friendships creep up on you without you realizing it. And you realize someone is your soulmate or one of your closest friends, or is God-given in your lives, and you only realized after they passed away, or after you've been married for 5 or 10 years, or after you've just been friends for X number of years. It goes in every direction. You can't, or you know, you just can't generalize. Churchill and Roosevelt meet after war is won at the end of 1918. Roosevelt has actually been Churchill's opposite number in America. Now, we always think of Churchill as the great admiral, the war leader, the first lord of the Admiralty in 2 world wars, the naval genius. In fact, as I've shown, as long as he ran the Royal Navy sank. He sank battleships. He sank about 8 battleships and a dozen cruisers. And even at the Battle of Jutland, the curse of Churchill was on the Royal Navy, because 3 British battle cruisers explode within an hour of each other because of plunging shell fire, because they don't have the heavy armor to protect themselves in a straight duel with German heavy weapon battleships. And 3,000 British soldiers are incinerated instantly. And the admiral commanding them, directly responsible for this fiasco, yet another Churchill favorite, a bungler called Admiral David Beatty. So even Admiral Beatty, who is famous for being one of the most dimmest admirals in naval history, turns to one of his senior officers after he's just watched 3 of his own 6 battle cruisers explode without warning, and offers the following profound observation: "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." And that's it. You know, that's all Churchill's genius admiral has got to offer in World War I. And we'll see something very similar in World War II. But this is, when Churchill, by contrast, Franklin Roosevelt is running the American Navy for twice as long as Churchill did. He runs it from 1913 to 1921. He is Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson loathes Franklin Roosevelt, which tells you a lot about Wilson. And the guy who is actually running the Navy is a pacifist. Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, who wants America to stay out of the war, isn't interested in building up the Navy, but is politically shrewd and is personally lazy at the same time. So he simply allows Franklin Roosevelt to run the United States Navy for him for 8 years, so he doesn't have to. And as a result, Franklin Roosevelt runs the United States Navy through World War I with brilliant success. And he selects and appoints the most brilliant Allied admiral of all in World War I, Admiral Harold Sims, the man who invents the modern convoy system, which the British sneer at and ignore for 2 years, until Churchill's appointees, who sneer at the convoy system, because like Churchill, they believe in always attacking the enemy, always attacking, but putting ships into convoys and having little ships around them are defensive. You know, that's not an offensive attitude. You got to go out looking for the enemy. Of course, when you look for the enemy and you've got big battleships on the surface looking for submarines that they can't even damage, which Churchill insisted on, but the submarines have torpedoes that they can fire from underwater, what happens? The tiny little cheap submarines sink the battleships. And Churchill never works that out, but Admiral Sims does. And it's because of Admiral Sims that the United States Navy imposes convoy protection when it enters World War I, and finally forces the British to impose convoy protection as well. And then the U-boats are defeated because of, ultimately, an admiral who was chosen and raised up by Franklin Roosevelt. But also Roosevelt, like Churchill, has come to see the American industrial complex and shipyard industries at close hand during World War I. And this, of course, helps them prepare and plan to build the giant United States super navy that will win World War II in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. But my key point here is that Franklin Roosevelt's record as a political overlord in a world war, in World War I, is infinitely superior to Churchill's. So when they meet at a dinner in London in 1918 in Whitehall, Churchill has a lot to learn from Franklin Roosevelt. What does he learn? He learns nothing. In fact, Churchill, who was obviously drunk at the time, because he usually was by that time of the evening anyway, simply does not even remember meeting Franklin Roosevelt, ever. And this causes an embarrassment when they meet as war leaders in person at the off Nova Scotia for the first time, 23 years later. By contrast, Roosevelt vividly remembers Churchill. Did you ever meet him in person? Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, who writes one of the great political diaries of modern American history when he's Secretary of the Interior from 1933 to 45. He's asking FDR this question in 1940 after Churchill has become war premier. Oh yes, FDR says, and this is, already when he's got the correspondence going with Churchill. But I didn't think much of him. He was a frightful bounder. He was not a gentleman. Churchill, who was filled with charm when he wanted to be, treats Franklin Roosevelt like dirt on the only occasion they meet in 1918. The war is over. Now, I really want to skip ahead to World War II, but there are two aspects we have to touch on here, and they are both very rich. From 1918 to 1922, Churchill finally makes it into the cabinet and he becomes David Lloyd George's chief troubleshooter. And with World War I leaving the world in chaos, there are a lot of troubles to shoot. The only trouble is Churchill keeps making them worse rather than better. He invades Russia. He declares war on Russia. He magnifies the Russian Civil War. It doesn't work out well. It almost backfires on a revolution in Britain, because the British working class, who are not communists and do not want to overthrow the monarchy or their established system, but they certainly do have no love for Churchill. And they are naive, and I would say very naive and ignorant about what communism will prove to be in the Soviet Union. But they identify it with the Labour Party, which is now rising and displacing the Liberals in Britain. And so Churchill's policy of waging war on Russia and even occupying chunks of Russia in the far south and the far north are anathema to the British working class and to many parts of the British elite as well. I mean, Britain has just lost more 1 in 3 of all its adult males, dead or crippled for life, or doomed to die in their 30s and 40s from the effects of mustard gas. As I've said before, a key experience shaping me growing up in Britain in my time was the enormous number of elderly ladies who did not choose to be single as a life choice, but who were lonely because their boyfriends or lovers or young husbands or the young men they had never yet had a chance to meet had died in their millions in World War I. And the pathology of this lasts for 2 generations afterwards until, as Lincoln says, time smothers all unrest. That's how, like Churchill, Lincoln is a genius at using beautiful language and rhetoric to cover up sometimes the most frightful and monstrous bungles and even outright crimes. But as Secretary for War, Secretary for Air Forces, and Secretary of State for the Colonies, which basically means being the absolute ruler of a quarter of the population and the territories of the entire earth, including all of India and of the Middle East and most of Africa at that time, Churchill did all this when he was still in his 40s, in his late 40s, as Secretary for the Colonies under Lloyd George after World War I. And there were 4 areas he was most of all preoccupied with. He creates Iraq. How do you think that was going to turn out? He creates an artificial country which has never been a unified country before. Two separate provinces of the Ottoman Empire with highly complex tribal and religious differences in their population. And he imposes over them his own friends, the Hashemite rulers of Arabia, who he wanted to rule Arabia, but they're so inept that the Ibn Saud dynasty, the original king, I always trip over the names here. The original king, King Saud himself, drives out Churchill and his supporters in Churchill's puppets from all of Saudi Arabia in 1925. It is a huge British fiasco. Why did Saudi oil come to the United States and not to Britain when Britain was the supreme political power in the Middle East through the 1920s and 30s? It was because Churchill backed the Hashemite rulers who controlled the holy places, who were lazy, corrupt, duplicitous, despised by everyone in the Arab world. And Churchill backed them because the one thing they were good at was flattering him personally. And he ignored the genuine Arab revolt, which was not T.E. Lawrence's fake revolt. That's yet another British fake revolt being stirred up to support British imperial interests. The anti-imperial forces that drove the British out of the Middle East were the Sunni fundamentalists led by the future King Saud of Saudi Arabia himself in the 1920s. And Churchill could not recognize corrupt losers from genuine representatives of their people who did have credibility and were respected at the time. I have only one solution for that. He was half American. Obviously, it was the American half coming out, because we've seen the same thing. We saw it in Vietnam. We've just seen it in Afghanistan. We've seen it repeatedly in Iraq. If you have corrupt, despicable losers, bank on the United States to back them every time. Every time. And Churchill makes that mistake in Arabia in the 1920s. Of course, he's also involved in Ireland. He eventually brokers a peace deal that pleases nobody. But for that very reason, it is a reasonable compromise and it lasts with the Irish Great Republican leader, Michael Collins, in 1921. And it sets off actually a civil war in the south of Ireland, which Collins is killed the following year. But it lasts. There is a myth again that Collins and Churchill drew to admire and respect each other. Actually, once again, Collins' attitude towards Churchill in reality is the same as Stalin. He distrusts him all his life. He cannot stand him. He doesn't trust him, but he does his business with him, holds his nose. And then when it's done, gets the best deal he can from out and says, I'm going to be killed because of this. Churchill, of course, laughs this off early as a ridiculous. You don't have to take the Irish seriously. But Collins, of course, was right. He was assassinated, possibly by his own side the following year. As Matt knows, there are many ambiguities surrounding assassinations in Irish history as well as elsewhere. But also, Churchill creates the Jewish community in Palestine. He doesn't bother really supporting it afterwards. The main support and buildup of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, comes under a man who has never given credit for it. 15 years later, a man who saves Churchill's political career, but who Churchill later turns on and stabs in the back and sneers at and despises, Stanley Baldwin. Britain's dominant figure in politics from 1922 to 1937. But Churchill certainly does defend the Balfour Declaration policy. Again, Churchill, as I've said before, maybe we should treat it here, the kind of racist Churchill was. If you can support and be of advantage to the British Empire, Churchill will protect you, as long as it suits him. He never takes any Chinese people or Japanese people remotely seriously. The fate of all Indians is there are good Indians, but only as long as they loyally support the Raj. Once India becomes independent, he predicts in the 1931 speech, India will be torn apart by civil wars. This did happen, but that was as a direct result of British policies under Clement Attlee and Lord Mountbatten did in 1947. India will sink into barbarism, savagery, human sacrifice, endless wars, and famine. The idea that democracies can succeed in an independent India is simply absurd to Churchill. He can only laugh uncontrollably at it. Churchill was not a prophet when it came to Asia. When it came to Japan, Churchill is most interesting. He saw the Japanese all his life until he was nearly 70 years old, as a joke, as people with big buck teeth who spoke English in a ridiculous way. Of course, he didn't speak Japanese at all, and wore huge, unstylish, ill-fitting glasses. Well, it is true that in Western clothes, Japanese diplomats did sometimes cut, at least to racist Western eyes, a bizarre figure. But it was a very unwise thing to do. And again, Churchill had no excuse for this. Churchill was deeply involved in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which leads to the Treaty of Versailles, a catastrophe, of course. And the chief Japanese diplomat there, who represents, after all, one of the four most powerful governments in the world already in 1919, is Prince Sayonyi, an extraordinary individual who you should look up, and he is the real hero of David Bergamini's 1970 classic work, Japan's Imperial Conspiracy. And he is the great champion of liberal values and political democracy in Japan. And he lives an extraordinarily long life, either 93 or 96. He only dies in 1940. And he opposes Hirohito's systematic preparations and drive to war, and the assassination of his own key liberal, genuinely internationalist and peace-loving allies as both political leaders, two prime ministers, and the most powerful banker in Japan are all directly assassinated as part of the same direct internal conspiracy in the early 1930s, which you have to, even 50 years after it is written, Bergamini's work remains not just the definitive work on this, it's the only worthwhile work that's ever been written on this, Japan's Imperial Conspiracy, which used to be available in paperback as well as hardback. I mean, you might have to pay $1,000 a copy for it now, I hope not, but you cannot understand the modern history of East Asia without reading Bergamini. But the point is the Japanese are formidable. Even under the Meiji Emperor, who, Matt, was not always the peace lover you wish that he was, far from it. Already with his full enthusiastic support, Japan has knocked out first China in 1895 and seized Taiwan, and then knocks out Russia in 1905, and then in 1911 completes its occupation of Korea, including the merciless slaughter of the Korean royal family, or what's left of them at that time. Theodore Roosevelt appeases Japan. It's one of his darkest imperial things he does, and basically sells out the Korean people to the non-existent mercies of the Japanese already while the Meiji Emperor is still in this world, is still alive. But American President Wilson is as blithely racist and blind to the formidable capabilities of the Japanese as Churchill is. As late as 1940-41, Winston Churchill sends two of the pride and joy of his fleet, the Prince of Wales, the same battleship that fought the Bismarck and survived it, and then he chooses it personally as to sail to Franklin Roosevelt to impress President Roosevelt with Britain's dominance of the waves when they first meet off Nova Scotia to sign the Atlantic Charter in August 1941. And so this is Churchill's favorite battleship. So he sends it halfway around the world to Singapore in the winter of 1941, the end of 1941, along with the battlecruiser Repulse, to deter the Japanese. Now, it's already 36 years since the Japanese sank the entire Russian navy, or what was left of it, at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, one of the most decisive naval victories of all time. And Japan had been Britain's ally through World War I and was of priceless importance in protecting the British Empire. And in 1921, a president who the British quietly hate and fear, who they character assassinate after his death, President Warren G. Harding. Yet another case of being the opposites of what they appear to be. Warren Harding is not the drunken, naive, self-indulgent, lazy joke that American liberals have always made him out to be, and modern American imperial conservatives sneer at. In a way, he is the responsible for the final liquidation of the British Empire. because he insists at the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 that Britain accepts parity with the United States in battleships and maritime warship construction. And this is the end of a 300-year tradition in which, since the time of Oliver Cromwell, 1640s, 1650s, it is held by British naval planners that the British Navy must be more powerful than the two second and third most powerful navies in the world combined. But modern industrial realities have made that an impossibility. And even then, you could get away with it with cunning diplomacy. And if you have a naive American imperial leader who's weak at the knees over the British, like Theodore Roosevelt had been, and shares their racism. But once you get a genuinely patriotic, nationalist American president who puts American interests first, like President Harding, the game is up. But once they agree to parity with America in 1921, and Churchill is grudgingly part of that agreement, though he doesn't seem to fully realize the depths and strategic significance of it at the time, the British are faced with another dilemma, because Churchill is crushing the Irish at the time. He has let loose the paramilitary Black and Tans, and the United States has used similar forces set up by the CIA in Iraq and Vietnam and other places to operate not as regular militaries do, but to operate outside the law, so that you don't have to be soft to these evil guerrilla terrorists who want you out of their country. It never works. It never works. The opposite happens. You wreck the chain of command and you wreck the efficiency of your own army, because however disciplined your own army remains, morale plunges, attacks on regular soldiers increase, provoking responses from them. And above all else, you are doing precisely what Ho Chi Minh recognized in Vietnam. You are losing the political dimension of the war, even if you appear to be winning the military, and the political dimension always outrates the military dimension. My old friend, the brilliant American military analyst, Bill Lind, William S. Lind, is fond of saying, and I've heard him say it repeatedly for the past 20 years, that the reason the British have done so well in Northern Ireland in the last 50 years is because the British Army and the security forces have consistently accepted and taken higher casualties than they inflicted in return on the Irish Republican Army, or most of all, on the Irish Catholic civilian population. Now, there are lots of exceptions to that rule, I can assure you. I can very much assure you. But Bill basically has it right. The more you inflict civilian population, or on a civilian population, the more you lose that war. And even regular American generals who have presided over the war in Afghanistan, like General Stanley McChrystal, have very courageously and rightly come out consistently and repeatedly since then and said, you cannot win a war in Afghanistan by purely military means alone. There always has to be a political dimension to it that you must settle first. And that is the only way you can settle these kinds of wars. Churchill does not realize this in Ireland, but it sets up a secondary problem. Because the Irish, as I rate in my book, Cycles of Change, these are the 1920s. The Irish have come to political power in America. They will not take national power until Franklin Roosevelt's great New Deal ethnic coalition comes storming in, and for the first time unites the ethnic urban industrial population with the WASP rural agricultural population in joint causes in 1933. National Industrial, NRA, National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, and AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. The two great keynote reforms that start the New Deal are for the land and for industry, because they're for all of the population, including the ethnics. But who leads and controls the ethnics? Why, the oldest and largest ethnic immigrant community of all does, of course, the Irish, because they run and control the huge political machines, which means in the days before the welfare state, also the main force for relief and protection of the poor and the unemployed living in the major industrial cities. You give us your vote, you support our local government, we make sure we take care of you. It's the way American political corruption works quite effectively to this day in the major cities. It's later adopted by other communities as well. The Jews are too idealistic for it, being middle class and educated by and large, don't need it. But African Americans and later Hispanic Americans learn from this well and fast, and Asian Americans have come up like a rocket, applying the same lessons since then too. It's a universal principle. But because of the rising Irish political power in America, especially in the East Coast cities and Boston, and because of Eamon de Valera's skill at organizing them in support of the Irish War of Independence in 1920 and 21, the British dare not do what they do throughout the empire. They dare not apply genocide or starvation anymore in Ireland. They dare not apply policies of extermination and mass torture, which they are applying in Kenya, including against Barack Obama's grandfather, as late as 1955. As late as 1955. They dare not apply these against the Irish because it's too close to home, it's too close to America. And this is openly discussed and acknowledged at the time in the papers, the Committee of Imperial Defense and of the British Cabinet, which is why Churchill is reined in. But before we move on, what are the areas of the world Churchill is trying to successfully pacify and control in the early 1920s? Northern Ireland, what is now Israel, the Palestinians, Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. Worked very well, didn't he? Solved those problems forever, didn't he? Lasting peace in Ireland, lasting peace in the Middle East, lasting middle peace in Iraq, lasting middle peace in Iraq and Iran. Oh yes, and there was also that little thing about stealing the oil reserves of Iran for 40 years. So that they really didn't believe what British preaching on democracy was all about. And of course, also failing to establish any worthwhile relationship with the Saudis because he backed the wrong side in Saudi Arabia as well. It's pretty comprehensive. But Churchill has a constellation in the 1920s. He gets an unusual second son. Now, this is a slight digression, and it is quite extraordinary because I've seen almost nothing like it in historiography. In World War II, a key member of the British government is Winston Churchill's Minister of Information, Brendan Bracken. Bracken is not, Churchill always hangs out only with fellow elitists of the British Empire. He makes a very improbable political alliance with the great industrial leader who becomes Foreign Secretary after World War II, Ernest Bevin. There's mutual respect between them. They make a marvelous team, but they never socialize together. There is only one exception to this rule. Right after he has spent years crushing the Irish, Churchill takes the son of a noted Irish nationalist and Gaelic sports and language pioneer, one of 6 children from a very modest background in the west of Ireland, into his own circle. He helps him get into Parliament as a member of Parliament. He sets him up with such powerful political and business allies and financing that the man becomes the publisher of the Financial News, and later on takes over the Financial Times as well, and becomes the co-publisher of The Economist magazine in the 1920s. And as if this is not enough, what does this strange young Irishman do? He goes around London openly for the rest of his life for the next 35 years, boasting that he is Winston Churchill's natural son. Churchill never denies it. The people who are in the best position to know Churchill's own wife of 56 years, Clementine Churchill, the beloved and sainted Clemmy, and his own son, Randolph, his only son, through Clemmy, and his only other known son, both hate Brendan Bracken, hate him, not because he boasts that he is Churchill's son, physical son, but because they believe it too. And then take a look at Brendan Bracken. And pictures of him all over the internet. And take a look at not the old, heavy, tubby, thick-set Churchill we all know so well from the 1930s onwards, Churchill in his 60s, you know, a couple of 100 pounds overweight, but with enormous vitality and built to match the smile and what have you. Take a look at the lean, young, ever ambitious Winston Churchill in his 30s and his 40s, when he's First Lord of the Admiralty, or right after World War I, or even when he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain's finance minister in the 1920s. And it is the same case I made to you about Christopher Marlowe and the image of William Shakespeare. You've got it, Stephen. It is the same face. Apply FBI software recognition. In both cases, it is the same face. In the case of Marlowe and the face on the folio, because it's the same man. Some fellow wrote into me, and superficially it's a reasonable point, and argued this on YouTube and said, well, there's the Chandos picture of Churchill, which we in fact was displayed on Rising Time website, and clearly the Chandos picture of Churchill, not of Churchill, of Shakespeare, obviously is not remotely like Marlowe. And I said, yes, that's because it's a bad likeness. It's a painting. It's on a photograph. It doesn't look like the man really was. But if you look at the most important, the iconic picture of Shakespeare on the first folio in 1623, and you superimpose that on the one surviving painting of Marlowe, which is indisputably that of Marlowe, which is discovered at Cambridge University in 1953, just look at them. It is the same man. And we look at Brendan Bracken, and what do we see? The same. In his youth, not tall, but in his youth, quite slim. And unlike Churchill, he never ate ferociously, so never, you know, afterwards, we think of Tubby Churchill. He doesn't look a bit like the older Bracken, and Bracken dies in his 50s anyway. So you have to look back to younger pictures of Churchill. But it's the same face, it's the same eyes. It's the same hair. They're both redheads. The hair is the same type of hair. It's fizzy, it's fuzzy. Now, I mean, I see even in our family, our son doesn't have my hair, nothing remotely like it. He has my father's hair. It goes in exactly the same way my dad, he never knew his grandfather, but it just waves. Zaki's hair waves in exactly the same way as my father Simon's hair did back in Ireland. But it's a different color. Why is it a different color? Because it's auburn, and my wife has auburn hair. So all of our kids take after their mom in having the color of her, and you can see bits of me here and bits of her there and this and that. And of course, as we all know also, when you have kids and grandkids, other parts of the genetic pool pop out. In the jigsaw puzzle is different in every case. But if you look at the hair, the red hair of Brendan Bracken, it is the hair of Winston Churchill. And Bracken is important to Churchill. In the 1930s, Churchill has the support of only 2 members of Parliament out of more than 630. And one of them is Brendan Bracken. And the other one is a man called, who is worth a separate study and all by himself because of his extraordinary complexity and levels of good and bad. One of the most fearless and outspoken appeasers and warners against the threat of Hitler, Lord Boothby, Robert Boothby. But Boothby, of course, also has a lifelong passionate affair with the wife of future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, Dorothy Macmillan, to the day she dies, and is the father of one of Macmillan's children. And as if that's not enough, it is an open secret in London through the 1960s and the 70s, and nobody dares openly talk about it in print, of course, till after he dies, that Boothby is also a paedophile who is deeply involved with the Cray brothers, who, to add to the wonderful web of complexity between culture and politics we have here, are the inspiration for the Piranha Brothers of Monty Python. So in a way, you can go from a supporter of Winston Churchill in the 1930s to pedophilia, to organized crime, to Monty Python through Robert Boothby. Boothby eventually becomes too much even for Churchill. He thinks, as one of Churchill's most loyal supporters, he should come into government in 1940 and is briefly brought in. But even at that early point, Boothby's level of corruption is so great that it is exposed. And Churchill, who is certainly no prude and is certainly not immune to corruption himself or from it, fires him then, and Boothby never forgives him for it. But Bracken has a wild, well, personally, he's not wild at all. That's the interesting thing. But his life is most eminent and extraordinary. He is Britain's Joseph Goebbels to World War II, though I do not mean to make a moral equivalence between them for a second. But just as Goebbels was the propaganda and chief of lies for Nazi Germany, he is chief of propaganda and news and control over the British Broadcasting Corporation, no less, as Minister for Information for Britain from 1940 to 45. Now, in fact, it doesn't push lies at all. Bracken is an admirable Minister of Information. The BBC, you could trust the BBC's veracity far more truthfully in 1940 to 45, when Britain is facing total catastrophe, than I think you can trust them today, for heaven knows whatever reasons. But the BBC from 1940 to 45 is a model of truth and inspiration for the peoples of occupied Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people risk execution and torture at the hands of the Nazis if they by listening to BBC radio broadcasts secretly through the war. I'm old enough to have had the privilege of knowing a number of surviving people in the resistance in the Netherlands and France and Italy especially, who did so. That's how valuable the BBC was because of Brendan Bracken. There is even a theory which ties us to George Orwell. George Orwell worked for the BBC during World War II. And there is no doubt, this is well established and documented by his biographers, and Orwell himself was open about it, that much of his description of day-to-day life in the Ministry of Truth in 1984, especially the hideous food in the canteens, was the way bureaucratic life was working inside the British Broadcasting Corporation from 1940 to 1945. The famous journalist and wit Malcolm Muggeridge, who also worked on the side for the BBC at that time, confirms Orwell's account. He was a friend of Orwell's, when he's claimed to be afterwards, and has very many witty accounts on this. But there is now, of course, also yet another conspiracy theory that therefore Churchill's illegitimate son, Brendan Bracken, as Minister of Information, was actually the model or inspiration for Big Brother in 1984. Now, I do not buy that for a second. I say it to you first to shoot it down, and secondly, because quite simply, it's a great story. I mean, it's a wonderful story to have such an image. But Orwell himself was always, two key things about Orwell. Both elements are true. There's no question that the Soviet Union is what he primarily had in mind in 1984. He makes no secret about that. And in fact, in the last years of his life, Orwell, who hated and loathed the British Empire, is working as an informer for British security, for MI5, because he makes the same choice. It's a very grim choice that my late teacher Isaiah Berlin clearly made. He would rather have the CIA than the KGB or the NKVD. He would rather have Britain as Airstrip 1 rather than Britain as Gulag 15. Maybe if I say as a sick joke, if Britain could have been popped up to Gulag 1 rather than Gulag 15 in the Soviet hierarchy, maybe it would have been more tempting for some of them to make that choice. But I don't really believe that. I hasten to add on the record, right? But Orwell works in the BBC, and he draws the physical description of what control of the media is like, how stories are just subtly doctored every day, and most of all, how depressing it is to live in a socialized world of gloom where even the tea tastes like worse than dishwater. And that's Britain in 1940 to 1941. There is a secret weapon which gets Britain through World War II. It is drunkenness. Everybody consumes enormous amounts of liquor. And of course, here too, Winston sets the standard. The British writer, and he's not, C.P. Snow is not usually regarded as a wit, but he did come up with some very good lines. And he says, it is a mistake to think of Winston Churchill as an alcoholic, Snow writes. I have known hundreds of alcoholics as friends and colleagues in my career. and not one of them is like Churchill. No alcoholic could have survived the amount of alcohol that Churchill took. Churchill took more alcohol than any alcoholic could. In fact, he seems to have taken it in a watered down continuous flow through the day until World War II and even at the beginning of the war. But from 1942-43 onwards, Churchill undergoes very radical physical and mental decline. This is not widely understood. We know that Franklin Roosevelt was a dying man from October 1943 to the end of the war. As you know, we've discussed this in previous seminars, I do not subscribe to any conspiracy theories that FDR was deliberately murdered to make way for Truman. If anything, I would maintain that it is FDR's cardiologist is one of the great unsung heroes in American history because he kept Franklin Roosevelt alive for a year and a half when it looked certain that he was going to die almost immediately after he came back from the Tehran conference in 1943. What seems to have been again and again the triggering factor for the catastrophic deteriorations in Franklin Roosevelt's health were making the effort to go and visit Stalin. He could get Churchill to come to him. Churchill could not insist that Roosevelt come to him. He wanted to, but Roosevelt very rightly did not come, and also he distrusted Churchill. But Stalin was a crucial strategic ally, and Stalin would not leave the Soviet Union, or at least only as far as Tehran, within a few hundred miles of the Soviet border. But you find that in both of the great wartime meetings at Tehran and Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt suffers a catastrophic failing of health on both occasions. And he also does so the one time he flies out to meet Churchill at the Casablanca conference in at the beginning of 1943. Every time Franklin Roosevelt has to fly for extended periods on slow, unstable, piston-engined, as yet unpressurized airliners, it causes a catastrophic deterioration in his fundamental health on every single one of those occasions. Now, as usual, I've gone on vastly more on most key areas of Churchill rather than in World War II. But on World War II, I'll try and finish it at a gallop very quickly. And if there's time for Q&A, which I obviously very much hope there is, many of the vast areas that I have not covered, we will come back into. But at first in World War II, Churchill is obsessed, as he was in Gallipoli, with the British strategy of the 1790s and 1800s, the strategy of sailing ships and William Pitt and guns that fire as muskets and cannons that only fire ridiculous little cannonballs in small numbers. All he wants to do is make obscure landings with tiny British forces on contested coasts, and it is a catastrophe on every single occasion he does so. Even worse, he nearly throws away the war before he has a chance to win it. He becomes emergently Prime Minister of Britain in 1940. Now, the conventional wisdom on myth on Churchill to this day, which should be addressed, let me do it before I close here, is that like Edward Kennedy or other leaders, or Franklin Roosevelt even, Churchill grew, right? The areas where he was an embarrassment in World War I that I've gone into in such length, by World War II, he's above them. He's the strategic genius. Again, I go back to two quotations from someone I mentioned before, and this is a wonderful book for any of you who haven't read it. There are two, well, actually, it's in three places, but the first place is the book itself. The Unexpurgated Diaries and Letters of Field Marshal Lord Alanbrooke, A-L-A-N-B-R-O-O-K-E, that came out early in the 21st century, I think around 204, 205. And Alanbrooke was the British version of General Marshall. He was the professional head of the British Army through World War II. Not all of it, but from the beginning of 1942 to the end of the war. And Alanbrooke was, of course, a great Northern Irishman, well, who isn't? And also had been an eminent general at the end of World War I. And his relationship with Churchill was complex and difficult. After the war, they never spent any time together whatsoever. And yet Alanbrooke knows he's dealing with a genius and gives Churchill his full stature, but he shows the other side too. At one point in the middle of 1942, when they have lost the entire Eastern Empire of Britain, 300 years of British power and privilege gone like that, not a single British warship left. dares to sail in the Indian Ocean, not just the Pacific, but the Indian Ocean. Not a single British warship dares to safeguard the coast, eastern coast of Africa, because the Japanese have swept it out of it because of Churchill's bunglings and miscalculation. And Alan Brooke writes, we enter the second half of World War II, of 1942. I look upon it with dread. In the first half of this year, we have lost half of our empire, and I fear in the second half we may lose the other half. It is the figure of Winston. I still do not know what to make of him. Without him, we would have lost and been destroyed certainly in 1940. Gives him stature. And then he adds, with him, I do not possibly see how we can possibly win. In fact, the key to victory has already come, and Alan Brooke fought it. In 1942, at the beginning of the war, Churchill doesn't dream the Eastern Empire will be lost. He doesn't dream the Japanese are a serious threat. As I've told you in previous seminars, he takes the biggest gamble of his life, and it is that gamble which is totally ignored again, but documented. You look up this book. It is called Betrayal at Pearl Harbor. Betrayal, I have to look up the exact title for you, but the point is it is written by a former Royal Australian Navy officer who was a senior officer involved in ciphers, in SIGINT, signals intelligence, in Singapore, and was rushed out because he knew too much strategic information before the Japanese conquered Singapore at the beginning of 1942. And he his colleagues had broken JNS 25, the main Japanese operational naval code. And as a result of that, they were actually getting signals from the Japanese combined fleet while it was still in the inland sea, and also after it had set sail for Pearl Harbor across the northern Pacific Ocean. They not only knew that the Japanese were going to attack the United States, they knew exactly where, at Pearl Harbor, and they even knew when. December the 6th, probably, possibly December the 7th, but probably the 6th or 5th, 1941. And this information was sent to London. And at the time, the Australian Royal Navy officers who sent the information, who were honorable, honest men and patriots, were convinced not only had they done the right thing, which they had, but that the information had obviously been sent to the United States to warn President Roosevelt and the Pacific Fleet in time. There is no evidence that it was ever received, none whatsoever. On the other hand, Winston Churchill sets up an extraordinary event for Sunday, December the 7th, 1941. He invites the new American ambassador to London, who was already in the process of being seduced by Churchill's own daughter, with Churchill's full approval at the time. And that same ambassador later commits suicide after World War II when Churchill's daughter drops him and turns her back on him after their wartime romance. Because, of course, the romance was for the crown and the king and for the empire and for daddy. You know, just business. But he didn't see, obviously, the poor guy who was a New Englander did not see it that way. But he is invited to Chequers, the Prime Minister's, now it's still the traditional and official weekend home of the Prime Minister of England. And at the time, it was simply given to Churchill for his use by the family who owned it as a patriotic gesture, so he could get away from the dangerous Blitz in London at the time, because his own home country, home church, was just far too close to be in range of German bombers and German paratroopers, and the risk was rightly recognized. So Churchill invites the American ambassador to the weekend, and on Sunday evening at 9 o'clock at dinner time, does something he never, ever did before and never, ever did afterwards. He says to his butler, well, why don't we listen to the BBC News tonight? Bring in the radio. So they bring in the radio, one of those big clunky old radios, which I think virtually nobody here is old enough to remember, and which I still remember from even the 1960s growing up in Britain. And, you know, it's a power radio. It's pretty simple. it has an aerial which it's attached to, but if the wiring goes far enough, you can lift it and carry it around the room or move it from room to room. And usually you have to fool around with it and even move it to try and get more favorable reception. It's pre-transistor era, let alone pre-printed circuits. By our standards, it's very primitive stuff, but it works. And the BBC had a very strong national signal going out over Britain. So they listened to the news. And Churchill, but there isn't any news of this infamous Japanese attack on America. All there is a garbled report at the end when Churchill is getting more and more nervous and upset, and nobody can tell why. There's a report handed in as an afterthought at the end. Well, reports are coming in that some Japanese planes may have attacked the US base at Pearl Harbor, but we have no details yet. Churchill, of course, goes ballistic, insists that details be found, and of course, they get the full information. But Churchill has miscalculated. He is an anti-Asian racist. He does not think Asians are capable of modern industry. He does not think Asians are capable of warships. He despises the Japanese people. Unlike the Billy Hughes, the post-World War I working class Prime Minister of Australia, warns Churchill at the Imperial Conference of 1921, you must not sacrifice and terminate. Churchill approves of terminating the alliance with Japan. He thinks Britain doesn't need Japan. And the leaders of the British leaders who are racist and ignorant of Asia, like Churchill, agree with him. Who needs the Japanese? What have they ever done in the world? Well, they beat Russia, they beat China. Yeah, but everybody beats China. And really, everybody ought to beat Russia. And no one can beat us. Simple, right? That's the attitude of mind. But working class Billy Hughes, populist Prime Minister of Australia in 1921, warns the British Imperial War Council, you have just signed the death warrant of the British Empire. If Japan had supported Germany instead of being the loyal ally it was to us through World War I, we would have lost the British Empire and we would certainly have lost the war. You cannot turn your back on Japan and treat them so shamefully and so dishonorably and close the door on their expansion. They didn't close the door on our expansion. And of course, Billy Hughes is ignored. In 1941, Sir Robert Menzies is Prime Minister of Australia. He's a Churchill worshipper. He loves Churchill. He likes being flattered as being part of the Imperial War Cabinet. In London, Churchill keeps flying him to London. It backfires. Thousands of Australian boys are doomed to die of torture and hunger in Japanese war camps when they're captured, trying to defend the British Empire in vain at Singapore in 1941 and in Malaya. The pro-British government of Robert Menzies, a blustering old traditional imperial idiot, falls. He is replaced by the most improbable candidate imaginable. Any Australians here? I don't think so. Do we have any Australians? John Curtin, a man who, like Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, was a conscientious objector in World War I, becomes War Premier of Australia in 1942. And he has no time for Churchill. He immediately brings the Australian divisions back from the Middle East. He knows what happened to the Australian divisions at Gallipoli 25 years before when Churchill was free to play with them then. He isn't going to run the same risk again. He brings them back to defend their own continent and their own country. And he instead builds his own personal strategic partnership with General Douglas MacArthur, who has been stopping the Japanese with the hard-fighting American and very gallant Filipino armies fighting in the peninsula of Bataan and slow up the Japanese drive through Asia for 6 months. And then MacArthur, who is a corrupt and repulsive man in many ways, but is also a brilliant man and a very brave one and an honorable one, is basically suicidal. He is determined. He wants to get his wife and young son out of the island fortress of Corregidor, and he is determined to go down fighting or commit suicide in his last stand. I mean, he did bungle the defense of the Philippines. It is the biggest military defeat in the entire history of the United States to this day. To this day, 80,000 American, Filipino, and American soldiers are captured and most of them tortured afterwards, more than all those who are captured in all of America's combined wars, apart from the Civil War, combined to that point. It's a catastrophe. But of course, MacArthur is nothing if not brilliant and resilient, and his record as a combat commander and strategic commander for the rest of the war is brilliant. But he is ordered on direct order of President Franklin Roosevelt to evacuate to Australia. And with President Roosevelt's encouragement, he works extremely closely with Prime Minister Curtin. And to this day, those two together are regarded as the saviors of Australia in World War II, not pompous old Robert Menzies, and who's an old fool, and not Menzies' god, Winston Churchill. And to this day, it is Curtin and MacArthur who are seen as the strategic. And if even today, when you look at the new strategic deal Australia has signed with us against China to build these strategic submarines, which I think is very ill-advised in terms of Australian interests, and for that matter, on behalf of US interests too. But what is the psychological foundation for this, the tradition for this, the precedent for this? It goes back to the fact that in World War II, it was the United States, spearheaded by Franklin Roosevelt and Douglas MacArthur, who protected and saved Australia from being overrun. Because there is no doubt that if the Japanese top strategists had listened to General Yamashita, the genius who conquered Malaya for them, the Japanese army could simply physically have conquered Australia easily. The Australian people were very brave, but they were very underarmed, and their main combat force had been sent to the Middle East to serve British imperial interests, so they were defenseless, and the British had thrown the rest of the defense forces away at Singapore, and the Australians have never forgotten that. Churchill, my final point here, and then let us open it up to questions. But Churchill did not expect the Pacific Fleet to be sunk in Pearl Harbor, just as he never expected the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to be sunk. One of his best and most sympathetic biographers, the American William Manchester, documents that Churchill in 1940 and 41 believed it was impossible to sink a battleship from the air unless you dropped a bomb right down its funnel. Now that's childish. It is ridiculous. The Japanese Naval Air Force, operating not from aircraft carriers, but from land bases around Saigon, took less than 2 hours to sink the British fleet at sea. The battleship Prince of Wales, Churchill's personal favorite, and the Repulse. They both went down in less than 2 hours combined time. And that was the end of British naval supremacy after hundreds of years in the Far East. Everything else was mopped up by Japanese cruiser forces of the Battle of the Java Sea a couple of months after that. But Churchill did not expect it, and he did not expect 3,000 American boys to die at Pearl Harbor. He was willing to let the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor from the air because he despised the Japanese. He didn't think they were remotely capable of launching air attacks and sinking battleships. Only the British, maybe the Americans, certainly the Germans could do that. No one else could. Throughout the war, he is lecturing British admirals, why aren't you sending your fleets closer inland to Greece, to France, to Norway? And the admirals reply, because the German Air Force will sink us, sir. He doesn't listen, ever. So he falls into a panic-stricken funk, not the gallant Churchill that we know of history. He really has a nervous collapse. Not later in the war, not before D-Day, as that very bad movie with Brian Cox makes him out. That's entirely fabricated and entirely false. But Franklin Roosevelt is the figure who stiffens Churchill's spine after the Prince of Wales and the Repulse are sunk. In the early spring of 1942, what does FDR say and do? FDR says and does this. He says, Winston, don't worry. They won't get to Suez. They won't meet up with Rommel in the Middle East. They had the capability of doing that. We have plans underway that I am not free to tell you because they may learn about them. But we have plans to keep them occupied that will take care of them. What are those plans? They are that the United, it begins off with an extraordinary bluff. And here we come to the extraordinary chain of history again. I often bring this up, you know, Kevin Bacon, what's the word? 6 degrees of separation, right? How far are we from anyone? Well, you're only 3 degrees of separation away from Winston Churchill, because you all know me, and I knew people who knew Winston Churchill. So you're only 3 degrees of separation away from Winston Churchill. And you're only 3 degrees of separation, again through me, from the man who turned the tide of World War II in the Pacific, almost single-handed. General James Doolittle, who was a colonel in the United States Army Air Force, became the first man during war in history to be mad enough and brave enough and risky enough to fly bombers, large land-based bombers, off the decks of aircraft carriers in World War II. It was the Tokyo raid from the aircraft carrier Hornet, I think from the Enterprise as well. Certainly, Doolittle flew his B-25 medium-range Mitchell bombers. You couldn't fly big B-17s with longer range over aircraft carriers. The carriers were too small for them to take off from. The biggest, longest range plane that the Americans had that they could fly off aircraft carriers as a bomber, and even this was an enormous risk, and they could never fly back and land on them again, was the B-25 Mitchell. And they flew about 16 of them off the carrier Hornet in the middle of the Pacific when Japan had total control of the Pacific, and they bombed Tokyo. They did almost no damage to Tokyo. The one bomb fell quite close to the Imperial Palace. But because of the nature of Shinto and the reverence of the Japanese people for their emperor, everyone was horrified that the emperor had been placed in such danger. And all of a sudden, Japanese strategy was transformed overnight. It worked even better than President Roosevelt had hoped it would. The Japanese, instead of using their combined fleet to drive west against the Royal Navy, which was no match for them, and against Spitfire aircraft fighters and Hurricanes, which were no match for the Zero, even though the Zero had originally been designed by the same British genius who designed the Hurricane. The Japanese were more open to his ideas than the British were, and they gave him a contract at a time the British would not. I think it was Sir Sidney Cam. But had the Japanese fleet sailed west, India would certainly have risen up for them. There were 45,000 British Indian Army troops defending Singapore in 1941-42. 40,000 of them surrendered without a fight and immediately volunteered to join the Japanese army and fought beside the Japanese army against the British and the Empire in Burma in an attempt, as they sought, to liberate their own homeland of India. Another death. How can you keep an empire in India when your own army won't stay loyal to you? Churchill was taken by surprise by this as well, never came to terms with it. So Churchill suffers a collapse. But the Americans launched the attack. Let me finish the degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, because I knew General Doolittle personally, amazingly enough. When I was young and new in Washington, I was taken by friends to be a dinner guest on several occasions at the Army Navy Club. Were the guests of honor, and it was an intimate dinner on both occasions. There were only about 7 or 8 of us there. And Doolittle, who could be totally ruthless as a commander later in World War II, but it was one of the greatest air commanders in World War II and therefore in history to this point, personally was the most unassuming of men, and great fun, a delight to be with, and a real gentleman. I can't tell you much more about him than that, but I met him on several occasions and I thought the world of him. I mean, he didn't have to bother being nice or gracious, let alone share jokes with me. And he did all those things. He was a class act. Winston, of course, was never a class act. Winston was a monologuer. And because Churchill's talk was so brilliant and enticing, and you know, he got away with it. I mean, who wouldn't want to hear Winston Churchill come out with endless jokes and insults and brilliant? And he was doing this into his 80s. He did this all his life. He did have a genius and a natural wit. So I'll stop here, though. There are other areas, of course, we could go into, but we could talk for 12 hours on Churchill, not plumb the depths of him. But here is this man who was a genius, who was arrogant, who as a warlord was a catastrophe in both world wars. Again and again and again. And he never understood major industrial war in World War II. Never. I finish with one more story, again from the head of the British Army, Lord Allenbrook. And you will, I paraphrase slightly, but not much here. And I love the look on your face, Sean. Believe me, this is worth it. An exchange between Churchill, January 1944. Planning for D-Day has been going on for 2 years. They know it has to happen in 1944. The beaches of Normandy have been picked. General Eisenhower, General Montgomery, General Bradley, and their staffs have been working day and night on the most detailed military operation of all time. And then Churchill suddenly decides it's too much of a risk. We shouldn't land in Normandy. And he sends the following memorandum to Allenbrook's incredulity and horror to his own chief of the Imperial General Staff. And it's an official memorandum of state. Prime Ministers of CIGS, would it not be more prudent, given the risks we are run? You can almost hear, Churchill's voice sounds wonderful on the radio. How could you not be a thoughtful, brilliant military genius if you speak like this in Shakespearean periods and rhythms all the time? Brilliant speaking voice for a wartime leader. You don't stop to think that much of the time when he's coming out with his codswallop, right, is something even Monty Python wouldn't dare to come up with. Would it not be more prudent that we land in a safer, more defensible location, as in Portugal, where Sir John Moores' army landed in 1809, or 1807. Now, this is quintessential Churchill, the love of British history, the love of 18th and 19th century history, and the absolute ignorance and incompetence of modern war and the realities of modern war that went with it. This is the Churchill in a nutshell, Churchill encapsulated, to which Allenbrook replies, and you can see why they never wanted to spend any time whatsoever together after the war. But Prime Minister, the Pyrenees Mountains are in the way. In other words, if you have to land in Portugal and wait another 1,000 miles through all of Spain and all of France before you can get to Germany, you've also got to climb the Pyrenees Mountains as well. And then Allenbrook adds, and if you think that is an inconsiderable obstacle, you are an even bigger bloody fool than I take you for. I paraphrase slightly, but look up the original. You'll see I'm not missing much, and there is even more in there. Another time, Allenbrook in his diaries writes to his beloved wife, who he hardly ever sees through the war. My darling Juanita, I long to see you and the children. My soul cries out for your company. Allenbrook is a very sweet and surprisingly sensitive man. His hobby is bird watching and the preservation of wildlife. Not exactly what you think about expect from the top artillery expert in the British Army, right? Another hideous day, 14 hours running the war in the War Office. And then after that, I have to spend another 8 hours when I should be sleeping and recovering at an endless dinner with Winston at Downing Street. The Prime Minister, drunk as a coot as usual, insists we must invade Greenland to take control of it at once. I remind him we already have Greenland. I end there. The look on your face, Stephen, I love it. You know, not every story one tells, especially mine, end up getting, the appreciative results you hope for. That's it. I'll make a natural ending here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. I gotta say, it's always fascinating to just sit back and listen to you unpack a gestalt that you've been working on. Because the thing that it reminds me of, for a time some years ago, I'd spent some months trying to remember my dreams. I don't know if anybody's ever done this before, but I would wake up in the morning and I would start writing what little fragments I could remember. And at first it started very slow. It was very, very, I would have maybe a sentence here, a sentence there of an image or something. But then a few weeks into it, I had to stop. Maybe it was about 5-6 weeks. I had to stop because it got to a point where every little thing I chose to scratch at that I could remember would just unpack more and more and more, to the point that I was filling up, 15, 16 pages of my notebook, and I could still go on for hours. So I had to start my day, and I had to leave and drop things. Now that was what I'm dreaming. I believe that you could actually go on for another 12, 13, 14 hours. And I feel like there's like this rational, lucid dream quality in how you're just unfolding and unweaving your concept. So it's a fun thought experiment.
Actually, we should do that sometime. Even I shudder at the thought. And that is, you and Cynthia can have me over, ply me with drink, and then go to bed or go out, take out a dinner, or go off for the weekend, and simply leave me in front of the machine. And when you get back, I'll be going like this, but you'll have 12 hours of something.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. That's on our to-do list. And Sean just said I could listen for another 12 hours. So there you go.
Okay, it's a deal, man. I want your email. Oh, and
we have time for a few questions.
We can't keep in touch on Facebook anymore because you're a person of principle.
Nah, I mean, there's VK. We could do that. But let's do this. We have time for maybe 30 minutes of questions. Q&A. I know Stephen got in early. Stephen, do you want to launch your thought?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marty. I mean, because we share an Irish sort of sense of humor, you'll appreciate when I say that your lecture was so good, it was worth more than the price of admission. Of course, I'm being a little bugger. It was actually fantastic. Thank you. I've been to Istanbul during my military time, and I've been to Gallipoli and Troy, a lot of other places. What a super experience. So I share that with you as well. My question goes back to your observations on what appears to be a strategic blunder in World War I in getting Turkey into the war on the side of the Germans. And then the whole thing with not blocking off the eastern end of the straits and the ships. Because I'm more towards the conspiratorial perspective, if you took a Carroll Quigley sort of view of things, could you tie the Balfour Declaration into that and say that there was intent to bring Turkey or the end of the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of Germany with the strategic intent of destroying their holdings in the Middle East and opening things up for what the Balfour Declaration was intended to achieve? Is there a possible connection there, or is that just total speculation?
This is a reason I both love and dread talking with you, as with Matt, because you bring up issues that whether I agree with them 100% or disagree with them 100%, and here in a way it's both, but you bring up wonderful issues that need to be explored and that nobody else has ever thought of making or associating. The answer is twofold. First, and I have some background on this too, additional background, because I did my graduate work in my 20s at the London School of Economics on the Middle East, and actually on British imperial policy towards the Middle East from 1914 to 1945, under the world's leading expert on the subject, who died more than a quarter of a century ago, the late Professor Elie Kaduri, who was Professor of Politics at London University. And Kaduri had a huge respect for the Ottoman Empire and had nothing but withering contempt for the way the British managed the Middle East when they became the successor empire to the Ottomans. He far preferred the Ottomans to the Brits. Now, he did not go into this directly, but there are two aspects of this. The first is, up to now, I have always simply assumed stupidity, recklessness, and incompetence, which, given the British generals and admirals of World War I in general, and Churchill in particular, should never be overlooked. But when one looks at Churchill morally and strategically, actually, you are completely right, because something that has never ever been brought up, I have not even thought of it until now, is the parallels between Churchill's role in bringing the United States into both world wars, into World War I. Mm-hmm. Of course, you're ahead of me here. In 1915, as I've discussed in previous lectures, Churchill actually wants to draw America into the war already. He commissions the liner Lusitania with more than 1,000 passengers as an armored cruiser, which is ludicrous. But he calls it an armored cruiser, which automatically makes it a legitimate target for German submarines and warships to attack.
I wrote down Lusitania on my notes as you were making your lecture. I was going to bring that up too.
Oh, absolutely. And the Lusitania is torpedoed by the German embassy in consulate in New York are old-fashioned gentlemen. They play by the rules. They publish in the spring of 1915 in every New York newspaper, major newspaper, including the New York Times, a warning saying that the British are carrying contraband. They are carrying weapons of war, munitions on the Lusitania. And that is right. It is Churchill who has personally ordered it done as First Lord of the Admiralty and overseen the whole operation. And therefore, the Germans the German diplomats say, please, American citizens, none of you that sail on the Lusitania, because the threat will be too great. The threat will be too great, because we will try to sink that ship as a legitimate target of war. But of course, the ship sails anyway. The ship is torpedoed, it sinks. And one of the many political benefits it brings to Churchill and to Britain is that until that point, Theodore Roosevelt, as I discussed in an earlier lecture that I think Matt and the Foundation still have online here, it's what tilts Roosevelt, who is a lunatic. TR is a lunatic for mad action, aggressive action, doesn't matter who against, but it tilts him decisively on the side of the Allies, which he's been tilting to anyway. And from then onwards, TR starts his ludicrous and insane crusade to bring America into the war 2 years earlier than it actually came in, which, as I pointed out in my previous lecture here, would certainly have caused a minimum of 2 million more American boys dying on the Western Front in fruitless wars. And if that had happened, the very best parts of the American century that we all take for granted now could never have happened. At best, America would have been exhausted and desperate and sad, like Britain and France between the two wars, or it would have gone into some kind of ugly nationalistic fascism like Germany or Italy. And that's what TR would have led us to. But it's Winston Churchill who puts us on the road, and because, again, also Churchill is a gambler. And Churchill does, in his own way, try to think cunningly and strategically ahead. As I documented when he withholds the betrayal at Pearl Harbor. I'm pretty sure that is the name of the book. If anyone has any trouble finding it, I have it here, so contact me directly, I'll give it to you. But the name should be Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, okay? It should be that. But Churchill is a gambler. One point I haven't discussed here at all, and I don't have any information on it, and there may be nothing to it, but it's intriguing to me. There's no question that Churchill was a Freemason before World War II, but lots of people, many of whom have been drinking buddies of mine over the years, have been Freemasons over the years without wearing horns and tails, at least as far as I know, in public or whatever. But the question, there's a more intriguing question which is floated. Well, he was a Druid. Now, I've never seen any independent evidence that he was a Druid at all, but I love the idea of Churchill running around in Druid robes or something and believing who knows this or who knows that. If anyone knows anything about this or has any documentation to share, please do so. Please do so.
Yeah, I'll send you a picture of Churchill in the middle of a Druidic meeting.
Absolutely. And then again, he may just have done it for free drink. He was perfectly capable of doing that. When you look at Churchill, there's the most revealing insight into Churchill is the novel he wrote with himself as hero when he was young, Savrola, Savrola. And it's hugely revealing. It's a 19th century romantic hero on the Garibaldi style who brings about a gallant democratic revolution, overthrowing an old, stupid, staid version of state, sets off a civil war and a national collapse, but doesn't care about it. And he is not a Christian or not ethically driven in any way, and appears not to believe in any conspiracy theories of either communism or wealth either at that time. He's an egotist. This is a man, you must remember, who admired Napoleon enormously and always had a bust of Napoleon on his desk all his life, which he shared with one other World War II major war leader. Does anyone know who this was or venture a guess? You will find this enlightening. Emperor Hirohito. He purchased it himself when he was visiting France as Crown Prince of Japan in 1920. He had on his desk until 1945 two busts of the two heroes and philosophical guides he most admired in the whole world. Neither of them were Japanese. One was Napoleon. The other was, any takers? Charles Darwin. A week before, after the surrender, just days before General MacArthur made his amazingly courageous and daring landing at the Kagi airport in southern Japan to start the occupation and the restructuring of Japan, Hirohito added a third bust to his desk, Abraham Lincoln. Did I say that too quietly? Abraham Lincoln. Plutarch was right. Plutarch tells us nearly 2,000 years ago, you have to look for the smallest details in the lives of great leaders or key figures in history to get the revealing things about them. Churchill revered Napoleon. Churchill's novel Savrola, which is an embarrassingly badly written novel, of course, which makes it all the more entertaining. And you should read Theodore Roosevelt's novel Alf No Land about his vision of Zionism as well. It's enormously revealing about the idealistic Israel, which certainly is very different from what reality required that we see today, from its stucking of major issues, and also revealing what an extraordinary, ungrown up, immature little twit Per Herzl as a human being really was. He was an international correspondent for his newspaper, but he couldn't write. He couldn't write. And it's wonderfully entertaining to read him as a result. And Savrola is interesting for the same reason. Churchill is pure ego. There was a movie that in general I rather liked, though with one huge proviso, and some of you may have seen it, called Darkest Hour. Yet another hagiography about Churchill came out last year, and it starred that wonderful, amazing British actor, Gary Oldman, as Churchill. Now, Gary Oldman's been known as, he's been called the human, chameleon, the human chameleon, because he looked, not only he takes on every part, he acts, he's indistinguishable, you can't see him. He's played a Russian nationalist general wanting to kill the president of the United States in Air Force One, and I have met Russian and American generals who looked and act exactly like Gary Oldman in that movie, right down to the beard, which is a scary point. Plenty of them are still active in both Washington and Moscow, of course, right? And Gary Oldman played Sid Vicious, and he played Napoleon, and he played Winston Churchill, best Churchill ever. But there's only one thing that's wrong in the movie. It actually has a bearing with something we probably won't have time for in this lecture, but perhaps on a future occasion that you raised, Matt, and that is how deep did the desire to surrender to Hitler and be his ally go in the British establishment in the 1930s? And I would say it went very deep indeed. And that movie pays tribute to that danger because it brings out Lord Halifax, played by a wonderful, Stephen, I think is it Callan, wonderful actor. And again, a man who can do anything, a man who previously played, of all people, Thomas Jefferson in the John Adams miniseries and played him exceptionally well. He plays Lord Halifax in this movie, and Halifax is not played as a naive wimp. He is played as a commanding, intellectual, serious, dynamic force who is convinced Britain has to make an alliance with Hitler, and the first step is making peace with it. And the real reason I believe that Halifax did not push to become prime minister in 1940, when the British Conservative Party and King George VI both wanted him, as did Chamberlain himself. They far preferred him to Churchill, but there were two problems. First, that's right, it wasn't even the Labour Party. The Labour Party would not serve under Chamberlain, but they were willing to serve under Halifax. People forget that. They were willing to serve under Halifax. Halifax himself said he had a pain in his stomach that day and did not think he could do the role. My own teacher, Eli Kaduri, believed the story, and he said, "Thank God for the pain in the stomach. Saved us all. thank God for the pain in the stomach. But the more I have studied the subject in Halifax personally over the many years, I come to the conclusion that is not the case. Halifax had negotiated the future of India and set it with Gandhi. He had been Foreign Secretary. He was known as the Holy Fox because he was so devoutly high church, Church of England, but also in politics, he was endlessly subtle and cunning and got every position and policy pushed through that he ever wanted. What I believe is that Halifax wanted Churchill to take the rap for losing the war and having to surrender. And then he would step in as the savior of England, as the Pierre Laval or the Marshal Pétain of Britain, but only after Churchill had done the dirty work of surrender for him. He wanted Churchill to become prime minister, but he underestimated Churchill, and he certainly underestimated, thank God, the British people. He never dreamed of the Battle of Britain or the evacuation from Dunkirk. They were beyond him.
That would explain the Hess affair.
Yes, but thank you so much for bringing that up. You're absolutely right. There are many deep angles in the Hess affair. The most far-fetched theory I have come across, and which therefore I actually believe may even be true, heaven knows, because simply because all the more reasonable theories cannot work for many reasons, cannot work. And this theory is that Hess was not flying, there's no question Hess was not flying to Britain on behalf of Hitler. Hitler was clearly taken by surprise, we have this from endless witnesses and from Goebbels' diaries. Hitler was panic-stricken. Not that Hess had secrets to give the British, but that Hitler, God help us, imagined himself as a man of dignity. The worst thing you could do for Hitler was to strip away his dignity. Churchill understood this very well, and it was of enormous value to winning the war and the future of the world. But Hitler thought he would look like a fool if his own deputy Führer, even though he'd only been put in a sideways position, was allowed to go to Britain. And there's no indication that Hess was mentally incompetent or insane at all. What Hess appears to have been was too humane. You've got to remember the date. It was not only a month before the invasion of Russia, it was also 2 or 3 months after the Wannsee Conference had nailed down the detailed bureaucratic planning for the annihilation of 11 million Jews and Bolsheviks and other Slavs in Europe. Even that just as a first step. Hess knew this. And there were actually a handful of Nazis who, at least before Nazism ran its whole course, became humane. One of them is a subject of mine in my new book. He's John Rabe. He's the good Nazi of Nanjing. He was the deputy head of the Nazi party in China before World War II. You're clearly well familiar with the story, Cynthia, as I see. And he was dedicated, he saved the lives of at least 200,000 people in the city of Nanjing, all Chinese, from the Japanese rape of Nanjing, which was the first and one of the most terrible of all the Great War atrocities, even at that time.
Martin, I'm only familiar from it because of you. You
Oh,
told me about it.
well, Iris Chang's book is still available, Cynthia, and I have a chapter on the book. In the book, I'm currently negotiating with a British publisher, actually, to get published. So, of course, I'll keep you folks posted on how that goes. But here is a man who remained an anti-Semite, certainly through World War II. But his anti-Semitism did not extend to the people of China who were not directly in the Nazis' path, and he felt pity and responsibility for them. And this is what makes him such a complex, and fascinating in many respects figure to deal with, and why he hasn't been taken up and explored in the West. Contrast Irina Sendler. Poland was full of anti-Semitic people, still is. But Irene Sendler was one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. She personally rescued 3,000 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. She used to smuggle babies. She was a plumber, and she smuggled babies in her plumber's toolbox out of the ghetto. Act of inconceivable risk and daring. But she's very straightforward. She was just always, she lived to be nearly 100, and she was just always a wonderful person. And people who knew her when she was a child or when she was nearly 100 describe her the same way. People, as a human being, describe Pope John Paul II in exactly the same way. Well, he was an absolutely wonderful man. Everybody loved Carol Wojtyla. He did have some strange twists to him. We could never understand why he hung out with Jews so much. He had these Jewish friends. Heaven knows why he wanted them. But otherwise, he was a wonderful man, you know. There's a movie being made about Irene Sendler now. Who's going to play her in the movie? Again, the wonderful ironies of history. An Israeli actress who was Jewish and who was stunningly attractive, neither of which was true of Irina, who was a very attractive and brilliantly intelligent lady. But you know, she would not have any, and she was too serious to enter modern beauty shows. So she probably would not have approved of this. You're making too much of me, she would have said, right? And it's Wonder Woman. It's Gal Gadot. She wanted to play the part. She wanted to play Irina Sendler. And there was previously another movie made of a biopic of Irina Sendler for American television in 2009. And it was played by another outstanding actress who'd also made her name playing a superhero, Anna Paquin, who played Rogue, one of the X-Men, one of the most popular superhero movie franchises. So there is something about this lady that is a superheroine and that attracts people to play her who have previous experience in playing this kind of role. You know, people who are just virtuous instinctively without thinking about it. Whereas other people are more complex. Churchill was certainly not that way. But I'm sorry, back with the key question that was just asked. I think I've probably driven away too many of our survivors on this. I've never thought of the possibility before that the British wanted to invade Turkey, but if they did, I'll tell you what it was for. It was not for the Jews, not remotely, not for a second, because the Jewish community in Palestine before World War II was tiny and inconsequential, and incidentally also saw its future as part of Turkey, and this is vital. David Ben-Gurion was the political leader of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, from the early 1920s. We have here, hopefully, I hope you're still on, Ralph, my dear lifelong friend, Ralph Amelin, who knows more about the history of Israel and its politics and the region than I ever have and ever will. And I stand to be corrected by you, Ralph, if you feel the need to it. But certainly in 1933, Ben-Gurion is already the clear leader, political leader of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, but he's already one of the eminent figures before World War I, when he's still only in his 20s. And what do he and his closest friend Yitzhak Ben-Zvi do? Because they already have the image of a self-governing national home that eventually will be independent in Palestine. And they see it as happening within the Ottoman Empire. They see their future in the Ottoman Empire. They go to Istanbul and study to become lawyers in the Ottoman Empire. There are photographs of David Ben-Gurion in 1914 and earlier wearing a fez. Wearing a fez. Nobody dreams the British will enter the war, but the British have a motivation for going into the Ottoman Empire. And it's not the holy places, not for a second, not remotely. It's Iraq, it's Mosul, it's Basra. It's the oil. It's the oil they want. So what? And Churchill is at the heart of those imperial calculations because he's already established, as I said, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1911 to safeguard the supply of high octane, well, they don't even use the term in those days, but they're looking for oil fuels for the British Empire. And therefore, I think this supplies the MacGuffin. What Stevens says, you know, the MacGuffin is the motive in an Alfred Hitchcock movie. Everything that happens in the movie afterwards is driven by the motive, which is usually improbable or sounds ridiculous, but it motivates people, it drives them. And with Churchill and the oil supply for the British Empire, you have the motivation for taking over Palestine. Now in 1917, they only adopt the Zionist policy in 1917, and this I am an expert on, and I have read the primary documents, and I was getting into trouble with the British, with not even so much with the British, more with the Israeli academic establishment over it in 1917. because the conventional argument was always that the British were altruistic. David Lloyd, there are two myths. David Lloyd George was raised reading the Bible, and he loved the Jewish people, so he wants to give the Jewish people back to Palestine because that's in the Bible. That's ridiculous myth number one. Ridiculous myth number two is that Chaim Weizmann, the head of the Zionist organization in Britain from 1908 onwards, who becomes the first president of Israel after 1948, Weizmann, and this is a matter of record, Weizmann plays an important role in developing explosives chemistry. This is back where you began, Matt. You said you wanted me to talk about big booms and blow everything up. Now I'm doing it literally. Chaim Weizmann was the British government Admiralty's top expert on explosives and on making them without the raw material you would get from Germany or even from Chile, where they were running out of it at the time. New techniques had been developed, in fact, by a German Jewish chemist that were crucial in making explosives. Fritz Haber, the man who fed the world, the man who pulls nitrogen out of the air so that we can make, what's the word? Fertilizer, nitrate fertilizer. He's the inventor of nitrate fertilizer. The world was incapable of supporting more than 2.5 to 3 billion people until before World War I, until Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch together developed an industrial process for IG Farben in Germany to develop nitrate fertilizer. And they win the Nobel Prize for it, for chemistry, and rightly so. And Haber goes on also to invent poison gas warfare in World War II. And Haber is also ethnically Jewish, not religiously. I mean, he's converted to Christianity when he was young. But of course, Hitler eventually drives him out of Germany for being Jewish anyway. The ramifications of these stories. But Britain doesn't have any chemists as good as Haber and Bosch. And the British chemical industry is very weak. The British have become totally dependent on the German chemical industry. So Chaim Weizmann is a major industrial chemist in helping build up the British chemical industry, especially for the British Royal Navy and later for the Army in World War I. And Churchill, also later as Minister of Munitions, depends on him a lot. So this gives him access to the British government. But this is not, he is not given the Zionist declaration because of his charm, as he imagines, or because of the war. He is given because the British government is prone to believing in conspiracy theory. They genuinely believe the Zionist movement, led by Weizmann, who dresses impeccably always, speaks very thoughtfully and with dignity. The Anglo-English upper-class snobs who I had to deal with as a young research assistant in London in 1973 and 1974, who remembered Weizmann, they had no time for any leader of Israel, especially not David Ben-Gurion. Oh, he was so ill-bred. He was so raw and rude in his manners. He wasn't charming at all. Now, Professor Weizmann, there was a gentleman, there was a lord, there was someone of impeccable background and breeding. Now, Weizmann was actually full of bullshit. He was a very vain and personally, in many respects, repulsive human being. His political judgments were ludicrously bad. He wrote a self-memoir called Trial and Error, which is worth reading because it's so self-delusional. What we now know is Weizmann really believed he had charmed Sir Mark Sykes, the top British expert on the Middle East, into supporting the Zionist movement by the honor of its cause, by the strength of its cause, and of course his wonderful, charming personality. What was Sykes saying at the time to the War Cabinet? He was saying, the Jews control everything in Washington and Moscow. The Zionists control all of them. The Zionists tell the communists in Moscow what to think. Lenin will not do anything before his Zionist controllers tell him to do so. Justice Louis Brandeis in America is the chief Zionist agent in Washington, and he tells Woodrow Wilson what to do and what not to do. The Zionists are the key to everything. If they are on our side, Russia will stay in the war and America will come into the war and rush its forces into the war and prioritize it. If the Zionists are against us, Germany will win the war. The Zionists will make sure no American army comes to Europe. The Zionists will make sure that Lenin makes peace with. Now, this was all absolute nonsense. There were plenty of Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution, And they all hated the Zionists like poison. Zionists who were unwise enough to openly describe themselves as Zionists and remain in the Soviet Union were quite simply liquidated systematically. All of them. All of the ones who got out and lived to tell the tale did so because they ran for their lives and hated the Jewish communists afterwards forever. The Jewish communists, incidentally, when Lenin hated religion much more than Stalin did. And Lenin organized a section of the NKVD in the Communist Party to torture and execute, as well as humiliate, all Russian Orthodox priests. And they did the same thing for Jewish rabbis, and they did the same thing for Muslim imams. But the twist, of course, was that they used Muslim communists who came from Muslim tribal backgrounds to torture their own imams and religious leaders. And they used Jewish communists who were in endless supply to torture and murder the Jewish rabbis. But the idea that there was this ultra powerful Jewish movement run by the elders of Zion and what have you was non-existent. Were there wealth forces involved in taking advantage of World War I in different ways? Yes, there certainly were. Though, if you look at the Rothschilds stay apart, but the Rothschilds take the biggest loss in their history of banking because they don't expect World War I to come. They are betting short on long and continued peace. And instead, all the best bets are short betting for war. And the Rothschilds, especially in France, are virtually annihilated. It takes them to the 1950s to start significantly rebuilding their wealth again. And by then, London is a key place for them once again to go back to and to do it from. But you have here a comedy, or if you prefer tragedy, or both, Shakespeare would say both, of errors. The British War Cabinet, and you see the way they're discussing this, and Mark Sykes, who died in 1919 and who therefore could never be held accountable or even grilled by skeptical historians afterwards, but he died in the Spanish flu pandemic in Paris in 1919. Sykes regards himself as an Orientalist, as an expert on the Middle East. And he's an idiot. You would get a better understanding of the Middle East from reading the Narnia novels of C.S. Lewis, or the Lord of the Rings, than you would from anything Mark Sykes ever wrote, and the ignorance of everywhere they go and they talk to. I last saw my old teacher, Eli Kaduri, in 1993. I had dinner with him in London. No, not in London, just down the road from Bethesda, actually, a place called Friendship Heights. Still only about 15 minutes drive from where we are now. And Kaduri was in his mid-60s, and it's extraordinary, inconceivable for me to imagine he was then younger than I am now. But Kaduri had made his great career through exposing British plotting and incompetence during World War I. It was always imperial, it was always malevolent, it was always cynical, and they were always out for the oil and the resources as a general theme. But the other theme that goes with this was the sheer amateurishness and ignorance of the so-called experts who advised the world leaders and who nobody in the real world ever called to account. These were the people who whispered in Winston Churchill's ear, or Balfour's ear, or Lord Curzon's ear. And the other key context you have to have in the fall of 1917 is this. The Third Battle of Passchendaele was being fought. Sorry, Third Battle of Ypres, known also as Passchendaele, was being fought. And it's another bloodbath like the Somme. 500,000 British boys are killed and countless more injured and crippled for life on the Somme. 300,000 more killed and infinitely more crippled. The figures are astronomical at Passchendaele. And on top of that, German U-boats are sinking British ships like leaves falling in the fall. Leaves falling in the fall, because the British have not yet listened to Franklin Roosevelt's favorite admiral, Admiral Harold Sims, and installed the convoy system. So the British are at their wits' end. They know not just they could lose the war, they know they are losing the war, and Russia has just surrendered, which means 1 million German soldiers in the east. Ludendorff can switch them west. the next spring. And to go back to Gal Gadot, you don't have Wonder Woman on your side as a secret weapon like you do in the 2017 movie to throw against them. The British are at their wits' end, but if they don't have Wonder Woman, who do they think they have? The international Jewish conspiracy. That's what they think they have, right? So from Wonder Woman being played by an Israeli actress to an international Jewish conspiracy behind the communists, you see, it all fits. You know, you bring in the Jewish conspiracy, you can fit anyone in anywhere. But the key is this: the British War Cabinet, at least till 1922, when a Times of London reporter, who is not a favorite of the British establishment, uses his position, he exposes how the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were actually originally a very bad forgery written by the Okhrana, the Russian secret police, 30 or 40 years before. They were actually originally based on a liberal article criticizing the French Emperor Napoleon III, which had nothing to do with either Russia or Jews or the Middle East, which came out in the 1860s. That's why the Protocols of the Elders of Zion includes this wonderfully bizarre section about, oh, we've got to blow up the subway systems in the major capitals of the West, because the subway systems were just being built in Paris and London and in the 1860s and had not even been started yet for another 40 years in New York City. And so there were lots of paranoid imaginations about them at the time.
It was
yeah, go ahead.
What's his name? Matvey Golinsky, who was the Okhrana forger who was working for what's his name, Rachkovsky, Peter Ivanovich Rachkovsky, who was the guy who ran the Okhrana.
Yes, yes, of course. And as you have pointed out before, we also have the fascinating degree to which the Okhrana may have been involved in permitting the assassination of Tsar Alexander II because he was too liberal for them. And the fact that a surprising number of late Okhrana era officers end up being the grandfathers or great-grandfathers of eminent liberal Western politicians in the West to this day, including your former brief Prime Minister in Canada, Mr. Ignatieff, no less.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, absolutely, and that forgery really served them well. And there was a really good book. I'm forgetting the name, but I'll share it when I pull it out of my notebooks. That went through some really solid proofs of the forgery, like the fakeness of the protocols, and it served them well because it did drive people like Nicholas II and his wife, who was I think it was a niece of Queen Victoria. She played a big role at spinning his paranoia, and a lot of people around him in his trusted inner circle, amplified the paranoia that he had of this big Jewish conspiracy, which caused him to also react in a very vicious way against the Jews in Russia at the time, with predictable effects that would arise out of that. And then Hitler also read the same thing and again believed in this Jewish conspiracy as well in that specific framing, and then reacted in his predictable way. So it's been useful for many generations.
Oh, exactly. I mean, you raise, as always, brilliant points here, which is the degree to which lies and myths, especially certain specific ones, are fungible and can be recycled in different occasions and in different ways. I mean, I look at the way in which we have, as you pointed out to me, Matt, the degree to which Belarus is being destabilized now by encouraging hapless refugees who have nowhere else to go in there to try and topple the government of Belarus, or to make a case that the government of Belarus is really the evil party involved. And you find these models of destabilization have obviously been applied in the last 30 years, but you find them operating in the 19th century already on behalf of Britain and France. They're very sophisticated and well applied.
Marty, we've rounded the 5 p.m. mark, but this has just been quite an incredible thing. I'm so glad I record these things. This is great. And I'm going to make sure that this goes far and wide to our network.
Bless you. I actually have to apologize again because, of course, I didn't get into more of Churchill's bungles in World War II, which, again, are endless. I mean, the key one, which I think I touched on, was he romantically refused to, he wanted to send British fighter squadrons, all the rest of the fighter command, to help the French when the French were already defeated and planning to surrender in 1940. He was going to throw away the fighter defenses of Britain, so the Battle of Britain would never have been fought. Lord Dowding, Air Officer commanding Fighter Command in the Royal Air Force, warned Churchill in the most explicit language not to do this. He sent a famous memorandum, which is even used in the movie quite accurately and correctly, The Battle of Britain, that if this happened, Britain and its empire and the cause of democracy and tolerance in the world would all go down to everlasting defeat if Churchill sent those fighter squadrons. Churchill ignored him and ordered them sent anyway. What then happened was Dowding simply rebelled. He ignored Churchill. He kept the fighter squadrons anyway. Churchill never refers to the incident in his 6-volume history of World War II, the Second World War, none of which he wrote, all of which was written for him by committee, and for which he was awarded a Nobel Prize for Literature. When the story was finally exposed by the London Sunday Times newspaper in 1961, British journalists from the paper asked Dowding, who was still alive at the time, what he thought of Churchill, not commenting at all on the story and never acknowledging it. And Dowding simply replies, how could he? He was bloody wrong, wasn't he? But the key point here is not just that Churchill was catastrophically wrong and that the Battle of Britain was fought and won despite Winston Churchill rather than for him, but that Churchill showed no personal generosity or grace whatsoever. He fired Dowding as soon as he could, right after the Battle of Britain, even though Dowding's performance in the Battle of Britain, all military historians to this day regard him as outstanding. He never used Dowding again. He also fired Air Marshal Keith Park, who was the combat commander of British fighter forces in the Battle of Britain, commanding Group 11, which was actually literally the force that fought the Germans. And Park was also treated in the most miserable and contemptible and shabby manner imaginable, though he ends up popping up, not because of Churchill, but despite him, in 2 crucial theatres of the war afterwards. He maintains fighter defence and British air superiority over Malta and over the Mediterranean, allowing the British to interdict the oil supplies to Rommel to prevent him conquering the Middle East in 41-42. That was the same Air Marshal Park who won the Battle of Britain. And later on, he becomes British Air Officer commanding in Burma and stops as a key part in giving the Japanese their greatest land defeat in their entire military history. An entire Japanese army of 75,000 men, much larger than any of the forces that MacArthur defeated in detail in the Philippines, is wiped out at the battles of Kohima and Imphal in the fall of 1944. And incidentally, it's not an Indian army that does the dirty work. It's a West African army of Nigerians and Ghanaians that perform outstandingly and beat the Japanese master race, which the British, of course, have no interest in glorifying how much they owe the peoples of West Africa.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's really some humble pie that I can't imagine the British elite ever being willing to swallow.
No, you might get humble pie for Thanksgiving in the US or Canada, but I've never had it at a British dinner table.
Well, Marty, you've given us a lot to chew on. Thank you so much for this delicacy of ideas, and certainly there were a lot of great intellectual bombs that you planted, and they certainly detonated. I'm sure more will continue to detonate as we continue to reflect over what has been said.
Matt, I never tire the way your mind works. These images are just wonderful.
Well, you're an Irish rebel. No, that could be misread. Of an intellectual sort. So let's just in
a very long tradition, then, yes.
The next week we're going to have a presentation jumping ahead a few decades to the life of Alfred Herrhausen, the head of Deutsche Bank, who had a brilliant plan for the post-Cold War age, which never saw the light of day for obvious reasons. And when Dirk Pullman, who's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, goes through this story, I think this will really give people a sense of the tragedy, the beauty, and the potential of our history when the torch was not picked up by people who should have known better. So that'll be that. And then a week after that, we're going to have something jumping back to a follow-up of Marty's presentation by Irene in Germany, who's going to go through why the British hated Germany so much. Why did Churchill? What was it about the German culture that pissed off the Churchill and the German elite so much that they had to crush that quality, that something inside of the German soul?
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So that'll be in 2 weeks' time, and then we'll have a surprise right before Christmas as well. So thank you everyone for showing up, and thank you, Marty, for sharing.
Thank you as always, Matt. Bless you.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.